Harry Potter pushed his trolley through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, his heart hammering as the solid wall gave way to the bustling, magical world beyond. The scarlet Hogwarts Express stood gleaming on the tracks, steam billowing from its chimney, while dozens of witches and wizards hurried about the platform with their trunks and cages. After 11 years of living with the Dursleys, believing he was nothing more than a freak, the sight of platform 9 3/4 felt like stepping into a dream. The station clock showed 11:15. Harry had 15 minutes before the train departed at 11 o'clock sharp, just as Hagrid had told him. He maneuvered his trolley through the crowd, Hedwig's cage balanced precariously on top of his trunk, searching for an empty compartment where he could collect his thoughts about this extraordinary new world he'd just discovered. Most compartments were already filled with chattering students, some clearly returning to Hogwarts, others looking as nervous and wide-eyed as Harry felt. Finally, near the middle of the train, he found an empty compartment and hauled his trunk inside with considerable effort. Hedwig hooted softly as he placed her cage on the seat across from him. Harry pressed his face to the window, watching families say their goodbyes on the platform. Parents hugged their children, giving last-minute advice and adjustments to robes and ties. A pang of loneliness struck him as he realized he had no one to wave goodbye to. The Dursleys had been only too happy to dump him at King's Cross and disappear. The compartment door slid open, and Harry turned, expecting to see one of the many students he'd noticed wandering the corridors looking for seats. Instead, a girl about his own age stood in the doorway. She had an air of quiet confidence about her that seemed unusual for someone their age, and her school robes were already perfectly pressed and properly arranged, though the term hadn't even begun. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent Harry had heard from some of the wealthier families on the platform. "You're Harry Potter, aren't you?" Harry's hand instinctively moved toward his forehead, where his scar lay hidden beneath his unruly black hair. Ever since learning about his fame in the wizarding world from Hagrid, he'd been both fascinated and uncomfortable with the attention his name seemed to draw. "Yes," he said cautiously. "How did you—" "Your scar," she said simply, stepping into the compartment and closing the door behind her. "May I sit? I'm Daphne Greengrass. I believe we have something rather important to discuss." Harry nodded toward the seat across from him, his curiosity piqued. "Important? We've never met before." Daphne settled herself gracefully on the seat, smoothing her robes with practiced precision. From a small beaded bag, much fancier than anything Harry had ever owned, she withdrew a rolled parchment sealed with deep green wax. The seal bore an intricate coat of arms that meant nothing to Harry, but seemed to carry significant weight for Daphne. "No, we haven't met," she agreed, "but our families have a connection that predates our birth." She held up the parchment. "This is a marriage contract, signed by your father, James Potter, and my father in 1980. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. "A what?" "A marriage contract," Daphne repeated patiently, as though she were explaining something perfectly ordinary. "It's a formal agreement between pure-blood wizarding families, often arranged to strengthen alliances or consolidate power and wealth. In this case, it was signed during the height of the First Wizarding War." Harry's mind reeled. Just weeks ago, he hadn't even known magic existed. Now he was being told that his father, the father he'd only recently learned was a famous wizard rather than the drunken layabout the Dursleys had claimed, had arranged his marriage before Harry had even learned to walk. That's impossible," Harry stammered. "I mean, people can't just decide who other people marry, can they? This is 1991, not the Middle Ages." A small smile played at the corners of Daphne's mouth, though whether it was amused or sympathetic, Harry couldn't tell. "The wizarding world operates by different rules than the Muggle world, Harry." Many of the old pure-blood families still arrange marriages for their children. It's considered not only acceptable but proper, a way of ensuring the continuation of magical bloodlines and maintaining family honor. "But I don't understand," Harry said, his voice rising slightly. "Why would my father do something like that? And why are you telling me this now?" Daphne carefully broke the wax seal and unrolled the parchment. The formal script was dense and intimidating, filled with legal terminology that might as well have been in a foreign language for all Harry understood of it. But he could clearly see 2 signatures at the bottom. One in his father's handwriting, which he recognized from the few letters and documents Hagrid had shown him, and another in an unfamiliar, elegant script. "Your father signed this agreement on July 31st, 1980, Daphne explained. "The very day you were born. The war was at its worst then, and alliances between powerful families were crucial for survival. The Potter name carried enormous weight. Your family was wealthy, influential, and known for their opposition to you-know-who. My family, as one of the Sacred 28, offered similar advantages." The Sacred 28? The 28 British families that were considered truly pure blood as of the 1930s, Daphne said, as though reciting from a textbook. "The Greengrass family has maintained our bloodline and our position in wizarding society for centuries. An alliance with the Potters would have been beneficial to both families." The train whistle blew, and Harry felt the floor shudder slightly as the Hogwarts Express began to move. Through the window, he watched platform 9 3/4 slowly slide away as they pulled out of King's Cross Station. The movement seemed to emphasize the surreal nature of this conversation. Not only was he leaving the only world he'd ever known, but apparently his future in this new world had already been decided for him before he'd even known it existed. "This contract," Harry said slowly, staring at the parchment that seemed to seal his fate. "What exactly does it mean? What does it require?" "The specific terms are complex," Daphne replied, "but the essence is straightforward. We are betrothed to be married when we come of age, 17 in the wizarding world. Until then, we are expected to honor the alliance our families created. That means presenting a united front, supporting each other's interests, and conducting ourselves in a manner that reflects well on both the Potter and Greengrass names." Harry felt as though the compartment was spinning around him. "But what if we don't want to get married? What if we can't stand each other?" "What if the contract is magically binding?" Daphne said quietly. "Breaking it would have serious consequences for both families. Financial penalties, loss of social standing, and in some cases, magical repercussions. It's not impossible to break, but it's inadvisable." For several long minutes, they sat in silence as the English countryside began to roll past the window. Harry stared at the contract, trying to process everything Daphne had told him. His father, the man he'd only recently learned to think of as a hero rather than a disappointment, had essentially sold his future to secure a political alliance during a war Harry was only beginning to understand. "Why didn't anyone tell me about this before?" Harry finally asked. "You were raised by Muggles," Daphne pointed out. "They wouldn't have known about wizarding contracts or customs, and after your parents died, you disappeared from wizarding society completely. Many people assumed the contract had died with James Potter, or that it would be quietly dissolved since you were being raised outside our world. But you don't think that?" Daphne shook her head. "My father consulted with several experts in magical lore after we received your Hogwarts letter. The contract remains valid and binding. Your blood status and magical heritage haven't changed, regardless of how you were raised." The train was picking up speed now, carrying Harry further from everything He'd thought he knew about himself and his future. He looked across the compartment at Daphne, trying to see her as more than just the messenger bearing this life-changing news. She seemed calm, composed, almost resigned to the situation in a way that suggested she'd known about this arrangement far longer than the few minutes Harry had been grappling with it. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since I was 8, she replied. "My parents believed it was important that I understand my responsibilities and prepare accordingly. I've been educated not just in magic and academics, but in the duties expected of someone who would one day bear the Potter name." The weight of that statement settled over Harry like a lead blanket. While he'd been living in ignorance with the Dursleys, believing himself to be a worthless freak, this girl had been preparing for years to become his wife. The asymmetry of their situations was staggering. "I don't know anything about being a Potter," Harry admitted. "I only learned my parents were wizards a few weeks ago. I don't know about pure-blood customs or politics or any of this. How am I supposed to honor an alliance I don't understand for a family heritage I know nothing about?" For the first time since entering the compartment, Daphne's composed expression softened slightly. "That's why I wanted to speak with you before we reached Hogwarts," she said. "You need to understand what you're walking into. The wizarding world will have expectations of you, not just because you're the boy who lived, but because you're a Potter. Your family's reputation matters, and by extension, so does mine." The train rounded a curve, and Harry caught a glimpse of the countryside stretching endlessly in all directions. Somewhere out there lay Hogwarts, where he'd hoped to finally find a place where he belonged. Now he wondered if even there his future had already been decided by forces beyond his control. "So what happens now?" he asked. Daphne rolled up the contract and returned it to her bag. "Now we get to know each other," she said practically. "We have 7 years at Hogwarts before the contract becomes active. That's 7 years to determine whether we can make this arrangement work, or whether we'll need to find a way to address it that protects both our families' interests." The compartment door slid open again, interrupting their conversation. A round-faced boy with a tear-stained expression peered in anxiously. "Sorry," he said. "I don't suppose you've seen a toad at all? I've lost mine. His name is Trevor." Harry looked at Neville Longbottom, though he didn't yet know the boy's name, then back at Daphne. The normal concerns of an 11-year-old starting at a new school seemed almost quaint compared to the revelation that his marriage had been arranged before he could walk. "No, sorry," Harry said. "We haven't seen a toad." The boy nodded dejectedly and continued down the corridor. As his footsteps faded, Daphne leaned forward slightly. "Welcome to the wizarding world, Harry Potter," she said quietly. "I hope you're ready for it to be more complicated than you imagined." The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of awkward conversation and meaningful silences. Daphne had returned the marriage contract to her bag, but its existence seemed to hang in the air between them, like an unspoken truth that colored every exchange. Harry found himself studying her more carefully now, trying to reconcile the composed 11-year-old across from him with the concept of a future wife, a phrase that still made his stomach lurch uncomfortably. As darkness fell outside the windows, other students began changing into their school robes. Daphne excused herself gracefully to find a place to change, leaving Harry alone with his churning thoughts. When she returned, her transformation into a proper Hogwarts student somehow made the entire situation feel more real. The crisp black robes, the perfectly knotted tie. She looked every inch the part of a young witch from an established magical family. "You should change as well," she suggested, settling back into her seat. "We'll be arriving soon." Harry nodded and gathered his own robes, which suddenly seemed shabby by comparison. When he returned from changing, He caught Daphne's appraising look and wondered what she saw when she looked at him. The famous boy who lived, or simply an awkward 11-year-old who knew nothing about the world he was entering. "Harry," she said quietly as the train began to slow, "when we arrive at Hogwarts, there will be a sorting ceremony. The sorting hat will place each first-year student into one of the 4 houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, or Slytherin." "Hagrid mentioned something about that," Harry replied. "He said my parents were in Gryffindor." "They were," Daphne confirmed. "But you should know that nearly everyone expects you to follow in their footsteps. However, given our arrangement, it might be advantageous for you to consider other options." Harry frowned. "What do you mean?" "I will almost certainly be sorted into Slytherin," she said matter-of-factly. "It's where nearly every member of my family has been placed for generations. Slytherin house values ambition, cunning, and what they call blood purity, though that last part is more tradition than official policy. If we're to make this betrothal work, it would be much easier if we were in the same house." The thought had never occurred to Harry. In his mind, he'd simply assumed he would follow his parents' path, as Hagrid had suggested. The idea of deliberately choosing a different house felt almost like a betrayal of their memory. "But what if the hat doesn't give me a choice?" he asked. "The sorting hat takes your preferences into account," Daphne explained. "It reads your mind, your values, your deepest desires. But it also listens to what you want. If you specifically request Slytherin—" The train shuddered to a complete stop, and through the window, Harry could see they had arrived at a small, dark platform. Students were already disembarking, their voices echoing in the night air. "I don't know," Harry said honestly. "This is all happening so fast." "I understand," Daphne said, standing and smoothing her robes. "Just remember that your choice tonight will affect both of our futures. Whatever house you're sorted into will become part of your identity at Hogwarts." They joined the stream of students leaving the train, and Harry immediately heard the booming voice of Hagrid calling for first years. The half-giant's familiar presence was reassuring amid all the uncertainty, and Harry felt a moment of relief as he and Daphne made their way toward the gamekeeper's lantern. First years over here," Hagrid called. "All right there, Harry?" Harry nodded, acutely aware that several other first years were now staring at him with undisguised curiosity. Word of his identity had apparently spread during the journey, and he could hear whispered conversations mentioning his name. "4 to a boat," Hagrid instructed, gesturing toward a fleet of small boats bobbing at the edge of a vast black lake. The moon reflected off the water's surface, creating a path of silver light that stretched toward what could only be Hogwarts Castle in the distance. Harry found himself sharing a boat with Daphne and 2 other first years, a round-faced boy who turned out to be Neville Longbottom, the same student who had lost his toad on the train, and a girl with bushy brown hair who immediately began explaining everything she had read about Hogwarts in preparation for their arrival. "I'm Hermione Granger," the girl said, as their boat began to move across the lake. "And you're Harry Potter. I've read about you in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts and Great Wizarding Events of the 20th Century, and—" "You've read about me," Harry interrupted, still adjusting to his apparent fame. "Of course. You're in modern magical history, too. You're practically the most famous wizard of our generation." Hermione turned to Daphne. "I don't think we've met. I'm sure I would have remembered." "Daphne Greengrass," Daphne replied with polite reserve. Harry noticed she didn't volunteer any additional information about herself or her family, maintaining the same composed demeanor she had shown throughout their conversation on the train. As they glided across the dark water, Harry found himself stealing glances at his 3 boat companions. Neville seemed nervous and kept patting his pockets as though checking that he hadn't lost anything else. Hermione continued to chatter about everything she had read, clearly excited to finally be entering the magical world she had studied so thoroughly. And Daphne sat quietly, her posture perfect, watching Hogwarts Castle grow larger as they approached. The castle was magnificent, its towers and battlements illuminated against the star-filled sky. Harry had never seen anything so impressive, and for a moment he forgot about marriage contracts and house politics and simply marveled at the sight of his new home. "Heads down!" Hagrid called as their boats approached a curtain of ivy that concealed the entrance to the castle. They ducked as they passed through into a hidden harbour where they disembarked onto a rocky shore. Professor McGonagall was waiting for them in the entrance hall, her stern expression making several first-years stand up straighter. Harry recognized her immediately from Hagrid's descriptions, though seeing her in person made her seem even more formidable. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said crisply. "In a few moments, you will pass through these doors and join your classmates. But first, you must be sorted into your houses. Your house will be like your family while you are here. Your triumphs will earn your house points, while any rule-breaking will lose points. At the end of the year, the house with the most points will win the House Cup." She explained the 4 houses briefly: brave Gryffindor, wise Ravenclaw, loyal Hufflepuff, and ambitious Slytherin, then left them to prepare themselves for the ceremony. Harry's mind raced as he considered his options. Everything Daphne had said about their arrangement made logical sense, but the idea of choosing Slytherin felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "I heard Slytherin turns out dark wizards," whispered a boy with pale hair and a pointed face who Harry didn't recognize. "My father says they're all blood-obsessed purists who think they're better than everyone else." "That's not entirely accurate," Daphne said quietly, though her tone carried a warning edge. "Slytherin has produced many distinguished witches and wizards. It's true that the house values traditional magical heritage, but that hardly makes them evil." The pale-haired boy looked at Daphne with interest. "Greengrass, isn't it? I'm Draco Malfoy. My father mentioned your family. One of the Sacred 28, isn't that right?" "It is," Daphne confirmed. "And you must be Lucius Malfoy's son. I believe our families have had dealings in the past." Harry watched this exchange with growing unease. The casual way they discussed their family connections and heritage made him feel like an outsider, despite his apparent fame. These children had been raised in a world where bloodlines and family alliances mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. Professor McGonagall returned and led them into the great hall. The sight took Harry's breath away. Hundreds of candles floating in mid-air, a ceiling that showed the night sky, 4 long tables filled with students who all turned to watch the first year's entrance. At the head of the hall, the teacher's table was dominated by an elderly wizard with a long silver beard whom Harry immediately recognized as Albus Dumbledore. The Sorting Hat sat on a stool in front of the teacher's table, looking old and patched and thoroughly ordinary. Harry had expected something more impressive for an object that could apparently read minds and determine a person's future at Hogwarts. The hat opened its mouth and began to sing, explaining the history of the houses and its role in sorting students. Harry listened with half his attention, while the other half wrestled with the decision he would soon have to make. Follow his parents to Gryffindor, or honor the contract that bound him to Daphne by requesting Slytherin. "Abbot Hannah!" Professor McGonagall called, and the sorting began. Harry watched as student after student sat beneath the hat and was assigned to their new house. Each sorting was met with cheers from the appropriate table, and he began to understand how central the house system was to life at Hogwarts. These wouldn't just be dormitory assignments. They would determine his closest friends, his daily interactions, and apparently, according to Daphne, his ability to honor the agreement his father had made. "Granger, Hermione!" The bushy-haired girl from their boat practically skipped to the stool. The Hat deliberated for nearly a minute before calling out, "Gryffindor!" Hermione beamed as she joined the red and gold table, where she was welcomed with enthusiastic applause. "Greengrass, Daphne." Harry's breath caught as Daphne walked calmly to the sorting stool. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, as Professor McGonagall placed the hat on her head. The sorting took less than 10 seconds. "Slytherin." The green and silver table erupted in applause as Daphne made her way to join them. Harry noticed that several older students seemed particularly pleased by her sorting, and he wondered if her family's reputation preceded her even here. "Longbottom, Neville?" The nervous boy from their boat approached the stool with visible reluctance. The Hat took longer with him, nearly 2 full minutes, before finally declaring him a Gryffindor. Neville looked relieved as he hurried to join Hermione at the red table. "Malfoy, Draco!" The pale boy Harry had spoken with earlier strode confidently to the stool. As with Daphne, the Hat barely touched his head before shouting, "Slytherin!" Draco's satisfied smile suggested this had been exactly what he expected. More names were called. "Not Theodore" went to Slytherin, as did Parkinson, Pansy. Harry watched the green table grow with each new addition, noting how the Slytherin first-years seemed to gravitate toward each other, already forming the social connections that would define their Hogwarts experience. "Potter, Harry." The great hall fell completely silent. Harry walked to the stool on unsteady legs, aware that every eye in the castle was watching him. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and it immediately began to speak inside his mind. "Difficult," the Hat mused. "Very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes, and a nice thirst to prove yourself. But where to put you?" Harry thought frantically about his options. Gryffindor was his natural choice, the house of his parents and his heritage. But Daphne sat at the Slytherin table, and their future together seemed to depend on his decision in this moment. "You're thinking about that contract, aren't you?" the Hat said, and Harry started. "Yes, I can see it all. Interesting situation you find yourself in. You could do well in Gryffindor. You have your father's courage and your mother's fierce loyalty. But you're also thinking strategically about your future, weighing consequences and obligations. That shows the kind of ambition that Slytherin values." Harry glanced toward the Slytherin table and met Daphne's steady gaze. She gave him the slightest nod, not pressuring him, but acknowledging the choice he faced. "Slytherin," Harry whispered to the Hat. "Are you certain?" the Hat asked. "This choice will reshape your entire Hogwarts experience. Your friendships, your enemies, your very identity will be different if you choose the serpents over the lions." Harry thought of the marriage contract, of Daphne's patient explanations about pure-blood customs and family obligations. He thought of his father making difficult choices during wartime, of alliances that transcended personal preference. "Yes," he said firmly. "Slytherin." The Hat paused for another moment, then called out clearly, "Slytherin!" The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The Slytherin table erupted in shocked delight. They had just gained the most famous wizard of their generation. The other 3 tables sat in stunned silence, clearly not having expected this outcome. Harry caught a glimpse of Dumbledore's raised eyebrows and Professor McGonagall's surprised expression as he made his way to the green table. Daphne was waiting for him with a small, approving smile. "Well done," she said quietly as he took the seat beside her. "That took courage." "Did it?" Harry asked, still processing the magnitude of what he had just done. "To choose your future over your past?" Daphne nodded. "Absolutely." Draco Malfoy leaned across the table, his grey eyes bright with excitement. Harry Potter in Slytherin. Wait until my father hears about this. You've just become the most interesting first year in decades." Theodore Nott, a quiet boy with dark hair, offered Harry a respectful nod. "Welcome to Slytherin, Potter. I think you'll find it educational." Pansy Parkinson, who had been sorted just before Harry, looked between him and Daphne with obvious curiosity. "So the rumors are true, then? About you two?" "What rumors?" Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The marriage contract," Pansy said matter-of-factly. "Word travels fast in pure-blood circles. My mother received an owl about it just this afternoon." Harry felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. "It's that widely known already?" "News of this magnitude doesn't stay secret long," Draco explained. "The Potter name carries enormous weight, especially when it's being joined to one of the sacred 28. By tomorrow, every family that matters will know about the arrangement." As the sorting continued around them, Harry tried to process everything that had happened in the span of a single day. This morning he had been Harry Potter, the unknown boy with the mysterious scar. Now he was Harry Potter, Slytherin first year and future husband of Daphne Greengrass, member of one of Wizarding Britain's most ancient families. The feast began as soon as the last first year was sorted, and Harry found himself surrounded by Slytherin students eager to make his acquaintance. Older students introduced themselves with the kind of formal politeness he was beginning to associate with pure-blood culture, and several mentioned family connections to either the Potter or Greengrass lines. "You've made quite an impression," Daphne murmured, as a sixth-year student launched into a detailed explanation of how his family had once served alongside the Potters during some historical conflict Harry had never heard of. "Is it always like this?" Harry asked. "Welcome to life as a pure-blood heir," she replied with the faintest hint of amusement. "Your name and your choices matter to more people than you might expect. But don't worry, you'll learn to navigate it all. We both will." As the evening wore on and the feast continued around them, Harry began to understand that his sorting into Slytherin had been more than just a house placement. It was a declaration of his intentions, a signal to the entire wizarding world about the path he intended to follow. Whether that path led to happiness or merely duty remained to be seen, but for better or worse, he had chosen to walk it alongside the composed girl who sat beside him, already planning their shared future with the same careful consideration she seemed to apply to everything else. The Slytherin common room was nothing like Harry had expected. Deep beneath the castle, the dungeon space might have been cold and unwelcoming, but instead it felt almost luxurious. Green-tinted light filtered through tall windows that looked out into the depths of the Great Lake, where the occasional fish or water creature drifted past like living decorations. Low-backed leather chairs were arranged around a carved stone fireplace, and the walls were adorned with tapestries bearing the serpent crest of Slytherin House. Harry followed the other first-year boys to their dormitory, a circular room with four-poster beds hung in green and silver. His trunk had already been brought up, and Hedwig's cage sat on the windowsill beside his bed. The sight of his few possessions arranged so precisely in this grand setting made him acutely aware of how little he belonged here. "So, Potter," Draco Malfoy said, as he began unpacking his much more extensive collection of belongings, "I have to admit I'm curious. How exactly did a marriage contract between the Potters and the Greengrasses remain secret for so long? My father follows pure-blood politics quite closely, and he never mentioned any such arrangement." Theodore Nott looked up from his own unpacking with interest. "It wasn't exactly secret," he said quietly. "My father mentioned it once, years ago. But everyone assumed it had died with James Potter. After all, Harry disappeared completely from wizarding society." Blaise Zabini, who had been sorted into Slytherin but had remained largely quiet during the feast, finally spoke. The real question is whether Potter understands what he's gotten himself into. No offense, he added, glancing at Harry, but you were raised by Muggles. Pure-blood marriage contracts aren't exactly simple arrangements. Harry sat heavily on his bed, feeling the weight of everything he still didn't understand. You're right, he admitted. I don't really know what any of this means. Until a few hours ago, I'd never even heard of the Sacred 28. The Sacred 28, Draco repeated, his tone suggesting this was basic knowledge that everyone should possess. The 28 British families that were still, truly pure blood as of the 1930s. The Malfoys, the Blacks, the Lestranges, the Greengrasses, families that have maintained their magical bloodlines for centuries without contamination from Muggle blood. Contamination? Harry asked, the word sitting uneasily with him. Theodore nodded seriously. Pure-blood families believe that magical ability is strongest when it's not diluted by non-magical heritage. Marriages within the Sacred 28 help preserve that strength. It's not just about magical power, Blaise added. It's about maintaining traditions, preserving the wizarding culture that existed long before the Statute of Secrecy forced us into hiding. When pure-blood families intermarry, they're protecting centuries of accumulated knowledge and customs. Harry thought about this as he changed into his nightclothes. The idea that his blood made him somehow superior to other people felt wrong. But he was beginning to understand that his personal feelings might be irrelevant to the world he now inhabited. The next morning brought Harry's first full day as a Slytherin student. Breakfast in the Great Hall was an education in itself. He noticed how the Slytherin table was arranged with older students, clearly commanding respect from younger ones, how conversations flowed in patterns that suggested long-established social hierarchies, and how other students from different houses watched the Slytherins with mixtures of wariness and disdain. Daphne sat beside him, as composed and perfectly presented as she had been on the train. "How was your first night in the Serpent's Den?" she asked with a slight smile. "Educational," Harry replied honestly, "though I suspect I have a lot more to learn." "Indeed you do." She lowered her voice slightly. "This afternoon, when we have some free time, perhaps we should continue our conversation from the train. There are aspects of our arrangement that we haven't discussed yet." Harry nodded, then noticed that several older Slytherin students were approaching their section of the table. A tall sixth year with dark hair and an aristocratic bearing stopped beside Daphne. "Miss Greengrass," he said, with formal politeness. "Adrian Pusey. My family has had dealings with yours in the past. I wanted to offer my congratulations on your sorting, and to welcome both you and Mr. Potter to Slytherin House." "Thank you," Daphne replied gracefully. "How kind of you to introduce yourself." Pusey turned to Harry with an expression of carefully controlled curiosity. "Mr. Potter, I must say, your sorting came as quite a surprise. The entire wizarding world expected you to follow your parents into Gryffindor." "Sometimes expectations need to be reconsidered," Harry said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Quite right," Pusey agreed. "I imagine your personal circumstances influenced your decision. Very strategic thinking. Slytherin approves of those who can see the bigger picture." As Pusey moved away, Harry realized that word of the marriage contract had indeed spread quickly through the pure-blood community. Other students were watching him with a new kind of interest, not just as the famous boy who lived, but as someone who had made a calculated choice that signaled his intentions regarding wizarding politics. Their first class was potions with Professor Snape, held in the dungeons near their common room. Harry had expected the potions master to be stern, but Snape's treatment of him was positively venomous. The professor seemed to take personal offense at Harry's very existence, asking him questions about potions ingredients that Harry couldn't possibly know, and then sneering at his ignorance. "Potter," Snape said during one particularly uncomfortable exchange, "tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry looked helplessly around the classroom. Several Slytherin students were watching with interest, while the Gryffindors present, including Hermione Granger, who clearly knew the answer, looked sympathetic, but unable to help. "I don't know, sir," Harry admitted. "Tut, tut. Fame clearly isn't everything," Snape said, with obvious satisfaction. "Let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" Again, Harry had no answer. Snape's smile was cold and unpleasant as he continued his interrogation, clearly enjoying Harry's discomfort. By the end of the class, Harry felt thoroughly humiliated and completely out of his depth. After the lesson, Daphne fell into step beside him as they left the dungeon classroom. "Don't take Snape's behavior personally," she advised quietly. "He has complicated feelings about your father. James Potter and Severus Snape were not friends during their time at Hogwarts." "How do you know that?" Harry asked. "Pure-blood families keep track of these things," she explained. "Social connections, old grudges, family histories. It all matters in our world. Your father humiliated Snape publicly during their 5th year. Snape has clearly not forgotten." They found a quiet corner of the library that afternoon, where Daphne spread several books across a table. "These will help you understand the context of our situation," she said, opening one to a chapter titled "Marriage Laws and Customs of Wizarding Britain." "Marriage contracts like ours have been used for centuries," she began, her voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher. "They serve multiple purposes, ensuring advantageous financial arrangements between families, strengthening political alliances, and, most importantly for families like mine, preserving pure blood lines." Harry studied the dense text, trying to make sense of the legal terminology. "This makes it sound more like a business transaction than a marriage." "In many ways, that's exactly what it is," Daphne agreed. "Love matches are a relatively recent concept, and they're still considered somewhat frivolous in traditional pure-blood circles. Our families believe that marriages based on compatibility of breeding, finances, and social standing are more likely to succeed than those based on mere emotion." "But what about what we want?" Harry asked. "Don't our preferences matter at all?" Daphne was quiet for a moment, and Harry thought he saw a flicker of something, uncertainty, sadness, cross her composed features. "Our preferences matter within certain boundaries," she said finally. "We're expected to make the arrangement work, to find ways to be compatible and mutually supportive. But the fundamental decision has already been made." She opened another book, this one focused on the sacred 28 families. "Your situation is particularly complex because of your fame and your upbringing. Normally, children in our position would be raised with full knowledge of their eventual responsibilities. We would have been introduced as children, allowed to develop a friendship over years of family gatherings and social events. Instead, I didn't even know magic existed until a few weeks ago," Harry said. "Exactly, which means we're starting from nothing, trying to build a relationship that should have been developing for years." She turned a page, revealing detailed family trees and coat of arms. "But we do have some advantages. Your fame gives you significant social capital, and your family's reputation for opposing dark magic aligns well with certain aspects of Greengrass family values." Harry studied the family trees, noting how the same names appeared repeatedly across different branches. It looks like all these families are related to each other in some way. Most pure-blood families are, Daphne confirmed. After centuries of intermarriage within the Sacred 28, we're essentially one very large, very complicated extended family. It's part of why these contracts matter so much. They're not just individual arrangements. They're part of a much larger web of relationships and obligations. A group of older Slytherin students entered the library, and Harry noticed how they nodded respectfully to Daphne before taking seats at a nearby table. Their presence seemed to change the atmosphere, making their conversation feel more public and politically significant. "There's something else you need to understand about Slytherin House," Daphne said, lowering her voice further. "We're not just students here. We're future leaders of wizarding society. Most of the Ministry's highest-ranking officials were Slytherins. Most of the Wizengamot members. Most of the major business owners. Most of the influential pure-blood families. Your sorting wasn't just about where you'll sleep for the next 7 years. It was a declaration about your political future." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dungeon's temperature. "What kind of declaration?" "That you're willing to work within the established system rather than against it. That you value ambition and strategic thinking over simple bravery or loyalty. That you understand the importance of pure blood traditions and customs." She met his eyes directly. "Whether or not you actually believe those things, your presence in Slytherin signals to the wizarding world that you might be someone they can work with." "And if I had chosen Gryffindor instead?" "Then you would have been seen as a potential revolutionary, someone who might challenge the existing order the way your parents did. Your marriage contract would have been viewed as a burden rather than an opportunity, something to be broken rather than honored." The weight of these implications settled over Harry like a heavy cloak. Every choice he had made since boarding the Hogwarts Express had carried consequences he was only now beginning to understand. His sorting hadn't just determined his house, it had positioned him within a complex political landscape where family names, blood status, and social connections determined power and influence. "I feel like I'm playing a game where everyone else knows the rules except me," he admitted. "You are," Daphne said simply. "But you're learning quickly, and you have advantages that others don't. Your fame gives you a platform that most people our age would never have. Your family name carries weight, even among those who disagreed with your parents' politics. And now, through our arrangement, you have access to centuries of pure-blood knowledge and connections." She closed the books and gathered them into a neat stack. "The question is what you want to do with those advantages. You could use them to maintain the status quo, to integrate yourself into traditional pure-blood society and enjoy the privileges that come with it. Or you could use them to push for changes, to try to reform the system from within. What do you think I should do?" For the first time since he'd met her, Daphne seemed genuinely uncertain. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should learn everything you can about the world you're entering before you decide how you want to change it. Understanding the system is the first step to either mastering it or transforming it." As they left the library together, Harry reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 days. He had gone from being an ignored, unwanted burden in his relative's home to being a key player in a political and social system he was only beginning to comprehend. The marriage contract that had initially seemed like an unwanted obligation was beginning to look more like an entry point into a world of influence and responsibility that stretched far beyond his personal preferences. Whether that was a good thing or a terrifying thing, he wasn't yet sure. But as he walked beside Daphne toward their next class, He knew there was no going back to the simpler world of ignorance he had inhabited just days before. For better or worse, he was now Harry Potter, Slytherin student, future husband of Daphne Greengrass, and apparently, whether he liked it or not, a significant player in the complex game of pure-blood wizarding politics. The October rain drummed against the windows of the Slytherin common room as Harry sat with Daphne near the fireplace, a collection of old wizarding newspapers spread across the low table between them. It had been 2 weeks since their arrival at Hogwarts, and Harry was beginning to understand that his education would extend far beyond what happened in classrooms. "These are from 1980, Daphne explained, carefully unfolding a yellowed copy of the Daily Prophet. "My family keeps extensive archives of important periods in wizarding history. I thought you should see what the world looked like when your father signed our contract." The headline made Harry's blood run cold. "Death Eater, attacks continue. Ministry advises magical families to remain vigilant." Below it, smaller headlines reported disappearances, mysterious deaths, and ministry officials who had been found dead in their homes. "It was that bad?" Harry asked, scanning the grim reports. "Worse," Daphne said quietly. "The newspapers couldn't report everything, partly because many journalists were too frightened to investigate, and partly because the ministry was trying to prevent widespread panic. But the pure-blood families had their own information networks. We knew how desperate things had become." She opened another newspaper, this one from late July 1980. Harry's eyes immediately found a small announcement buried on page 4. "Potter heir born. James and Lily Potter. Welcome son, Harry James Potter. July 31st. "Your birth was actually significant news," Daphne continued, "not just because your parents were prominent in the fight against you-know-who, but because any addition to an established pure bloodline was seen as hopeful during such dark times. So many families were losing members that every new birth represented continuity." Harry stared at the announcement, trying to imagine his parents celebrating his arrival while the wizarding world crumbled around them. "What made my parents such targets? Why did Voldemort want them dead specifically?" "Several reasons," Daphne replied, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when discussing dangerous topics. "Your father came from an ancient pure-blood line that openly opposed you-know-who's ideology. The Potters had significant influence and substantial wealth that they used to support the resistance. But more importantly, they had personal reasons to fight." She pulled out a leather-bound journal that looked far more personal than the newspapers. "This belonged to my mother. She was around your parents' age, and she attended Hogwarts with them. According to her notes, you-know-who actually tried to recruit both James and Lily before they graduated." Harry leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. "He tried to recruit my mother? But she was Muggle-born." "That's exactly why it was so significant when they refused," Daphne explained. "You-know-who approached Lily Evans because she was exceptionally talented, one of the most gifted witches of her generation. If he could have convinced a Muggle-born witch of her caliber to join his cause, it would have been powerful propaganda. When both she and James not only refused but actively began working against him, it became personal." The journal fell open to a page dated August 1980, just weeks after Harry's birth. Daphne's mother had written in neat script. "The Potter situation grows more dangerous daily. James confided to father that they've received direct threats. L, particularly worried about prophecy implications. All families with young children taking precautions." "Prophecy implications?" Harry repeated. Daphne nodded gravely. "There was a prophecy made around the time of your birth. Something about a child born at the end of July who would have the power to defeat you-know-who. Your parents knew about it, and they suspected you might be the child referenced." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dungeon's perpetual coolness. So they knew I was in danger even as a baby. They knew, and they were terrified, Daphne confirmed. According to Mother's journal, your father began making contingency plans immediately. Marriage contracts, political alliances, financial arrangements, anything that might protect you if something happened to them. She turned to another entry, this one from September 1980. Spoke with James about Greengrass' proposal. He admits the match makes strategic sense. Our family's neutrality could protect young Harry if Potters are targeted. Difficult decision, but these are desperate times. Children's futures must be secured while we can still influence them. The weight of understanding settled over Harry like a suffocating blanket. My father wasn't arranging my marriage for political gain. He was trying to protect me. Exactly, Daphne said softly. The Greengrass family had managed to maintain a position of careful neutrality during the war. We didn't openly support you-know-who, but we also didn't take the active resistance stance that your family did. Your father believed that if something happened to him and your mother, an alliance with our family might keep you safe from retaliation. Harry studied a photograph that accompanied one of the journal entries, a formal gathering that showed both sets of parents. His father looked younger than Harry had ever imagined, but there was a gravity in James Potter's expression that spoke of premature aging brought on by constant fear. Beside him, Lily Potter held an infant that must have been Harry himself, her eyes scanning the room as though watching for threats. "They look so young," Harry observed. "They were young," Daphne replied. "Your father was only 20 when you were born, your mother just barely 20. They should have been enjoying their early married life, but instead they were making life-or-death decisions about their infant son's future." She showed him another document, a formal letter written in his father's handwriting. This was sent to my father in October of 1980. Your father was proposing specific terms for the marriage contract. But look at the language he uses. Harry read carefully. "Given the increasingly dangerous circumstances surrounding our family, I believe it is prudent to establish formal alliances that will endure regardless of what may befall Lily and myself. Young Harry's future must be secured through connections that transcend the current conflict. The Greengrass family's position and reputation would provide stability and protection that he may desperately need in the years to come." He wasn't thinking about bloodlines or social advancement, Harry realized. He was thinking about survival. "The contract was signed on your first birthday," Daphne continued, pulling out the familiar parchment they had discussed on the train. "It was meant to be a celebration, but it was also an acknowledgement that your parents might not live to see your second." Harry traced his father's signature with one finger, seeing it now in an entirely different light. How many other families made similar arrangements during the war? "More than you might think," Daphne admitted. The Sacred 28 families were constantly negotiating alliances, trying to protect their children and preserve their bloodlines. Some supported you-know-who and gained his protection. Others, like yours, opposed him and had to find alternative means of security. Still others, like mine, tried to position themselves to survive, regardless of who won. She showed him a chart that mapped the various marriage contracts and political alliances that had been established during the war years. Lines connected family names in an intricate web of relationships that Harry was only beginning to understand. "The Malfoys allied themselves with you-know-who directly," she explained, pointing to their position on the chart. "The Longbottoms joined the resistance alongside your parents. The Blacks split. Some supported the Dark Lord, others opposed him, creating divisions that tore the family apart. Every choice had consequences that families are still living with today." Harry studied the chart, noting how few families had managed to maintain the kind of neutral position the Greengrasses had achieved. Your family walked a very fine line. My grandfather was particularly skilled at political maneuvering, Daphne said, with what might have been pride or regret. He managed to keep our family safe without compromising our principles too severely, but it required constant vigilance and very careful relationship management. A group of older Slytherin students passed by their table, and Harry noticed how they glanced at the historical documents with obvious interest. The past wasn't just academic history for these families. It was living memory that continued to shape their present circumstances. What happened to other children who were in similar situations? Harry asked. Kids whose parents made wartime contracts? Some of the arrangements worked out well, Daphne replied. Families that chose their alliances wisely found protection and prosperity. Others, she hesitated, others discovered that wartime desperation doesn't always lead to wise long-term decisions. There are several families dealing with contracts that made sense in 1980, but feel burdensome now. Harry considered this soberly. How do we know our arrangement won't fall into that category? We don't, Daphne admitted, with characteristic honesty. But we have advantages that other couples don't. We're both intelligent. We're learning to respect each other, and we understand the historical context that created our situation. Most importantly, we have 7 years to determine whether we can make it work. She closed the journal and began gathering the newspapers into a neat stack. The war ended when you-know-who tried to kill you and failed. Your parents' sacrifice saved not just your life, but gave the entire wizarding world hope that he could be defeated. The contracts and alliances they made were ultimately unnecessary for your immediate protection, but they remain part of your legacy. Part of my responsibility, Harry corrected, understanding the distinction. Yes, Daphne agreed. Your father made choices based on love and desperation. Now you have to decide whether to honor those choices or find a different path forward. The fire crackled in the grate as they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the echoes of decisions made in darker times. Harry felt a new appreciation for the weight his father had carried, making impossible choices while trying to protect a son who was too young to understand the dangers surrounding him. I wish I could talk to him, Harry said quietly. Ask him what he would want me to do now. Based on everything I've read about your father, Daphne replied thoughtfully. I think he would want you to make whatever choice brings you happiness and security. The contract was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a safety net. And what about your parents? Harry asked. What do they expect from this arrangement? Daphne was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. They expect me to honor our family's commitments and to use this alliance to strengthen our position in wizarding society. But they also want me to be happy in whatever way is possible within the constraints we're working with. That's a lot of pressure for both of us. It is, she agreed. But pressure can create strength if we handle it properly. Your parents faced much worse circumstances than we do, and they found ways to build something meaningful together even in the darkest of times. As they prepared to return the historical documents to their proper storage, Harry reflected on how much his understanding of his situation had changed. What had initially seemed like an arbitrary arrangement imposed by tradition now appeared as a thoughtful decision made by parents who loved him enough to sacrifice their own preferences for his potential protection. Whether that knowledge made his obligation easier or harder to bear, he wasn't sure. But it certainly made it feel more meaningful. His father had faced impossible choices and done his best with the information and options available to him. Now it was Harry's turn to make choices, hopefully with better information and more options than his parents had possessed. The question was whether he could prove worthy of the trust his father had placed in him, and whether he could build something positive from the foundation of fear and love that had created his current situation. As he walked beside Daphne toward their dormitories, Harry knew that understanding the past was only the first step toward determining what kind of future he wanted to create. The November wind howled through the castle's ancient corridors as Harry made his way to the library for what had become a regular evening meeting with Daphne. Over the past month, these sessions had evolved from formal discussions about pure-blood customs into something more personal. Conversations where they were slowly learning who they were beneath the expectations and obligations that bound them together. He found her in their usual corner, but tonight she seemed different. Her normally perfect composure was slightly strained, and she had been unusually quiet during dinner. A small stack of very old books sat on the table before her, titles that Harry couldn't quite make out in the dim light. "You're late," she said, though without her usual slight smile. "Snape kept us after potions," Harry explained, settling into the chair across from her. "He seemed to take particular pleasure in making me scrub cauldrons until they gleamed. I think he actually inspects them with a magnifying glass." Daphne nodded absently, her attention focused on the books before her. Harry noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she opened the topmost volume. "Daphne?" he asked gently. "Is everything all right?" She looked up at him then, and Harry was surprised to see something vulnerable in her usually composed expression. For weeks, she had been his guide to the wizarding world, always confident and knowledgeable. Tonight, she looked very much like the 11-year-old girl she actually was. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "Something about my family that changes things between us." Harry felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of something? Daphne opened the oldest of the books, revealing pages covered in dense script and disturbing illustrations of withered figures and dark, magical symbols. "My family carries a curse," she said simply, "an ancestral blood curse that has affected the Greengrass line for centuries." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Harry stared at the book, trying to process what she was telling him. "A curse? What kind of curse?" "It's called a blood malediction," Daphne explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when discussing difficult topics. "It's a very specific type of hereditary curse that passes through certain bloodlines, affecting some family members more severely than others. It weakens those it touches, gradually draining their magical and physical strength over time." Harry leaned forward to study the illustration she was pointing to, a family tree where some names were marked with small skulls indicating early deaths. "How long have you known about this?" "I've known about the family history since I was very young," she replied. "But I only learned that I might be affected myself a few weeks ago. My parents received a letter from a curse specialist at St. Mungo's who had been researching our bloodline. Based on certain indicators, they believe the curse may manifest in me." The book slipped from Harry's numb fingers. "Manifest in you? What does that mean exactly?" Daphne turned to another page, this one showing the progression of symptoms over time. The curse typically begins to show itself during adolescence or early adulthood. It starts with fatigue and frequent illness, then progresses to more serious magical and physical weakness. Those who are severely affected. She paused, clearly struggling with the words. Those who are severely affected rarely live past their 30s. Harry felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. But there must be treatments, cures. The magical world has healers who can. Blood maledictions are among the most difficult curses to treat. Daphne interrupted gently. They're woven into the very essence of a person's magical core. Some symptoms can be managed, the progression can sometimes be slowed, but there's no known cure for a curse this ancient and deeply rooted. The library suddenly felt suffocatingly quiet. Harry could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears as he tried to understand the implications of what Daphne was telling him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because it affects our contract," she said, with painful honesty. Marriage contracts aren't just about political alliances. They're about continuing family lines, producing heirs who can inherit titles and wealth and magical legacies. If I'm severely affected by the curse, I may not live long enough to fulfill those expectations. Harry pushed back from the table, unable to sit still any longer. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. I don't care about heirs or family lines. I care about—" He stopped, realizing what he had been about to say. "You care about what?" Daphne asked quietly. "About you," Harry admitted, the words feeling strange but true. "Over the past month, you've become important to me. The idea that you might be in danger, that you might—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Daphne closed the book with deliberate care. "That's exactly why I had to tell you. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about honoring our parents' agreement, at least for me." Harry returned to his chair, reaching across the table to cover her hands with his own. Her fingers felt cold despite the warmth of the library. "What do the curse specialists say? What are the actual chances that you'll be affected?" "The curse manifests differently in each generation," she explained. "Sometimes it skips generations entirely. Sometimes it affects multiple children in the same family. My parents are hopeful that because I've shown no symptoms yet, I might be spared. But we won't know for certain until I'm older." "How much older?" "The curse typically reveals itself between the ages of 15 and 20, she said. "By the time we graduate from Hogwarts, we should know whether I'm affected." Harry did quick calculations in his head. "So we have 4 more years of uncertainty. 4 years to determine whether our contract is a blessing or a tragedy," Daphne agreed. 4 years for you to decide whether you want to tie your future to someone who might not have a future. The weight of this revelation settled over Harry like a heavy blanket. Everything about their relationship suddenly felt more complex, more urgent, more precious. The girl sitting across from him might be living under a death sentence, and she was giving him the opportunity to walk away before he became too attached. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "For me to walk away?" "I want you to make an informed choice," she replied. "When my parents negotiated this contract with your father, the curse wasn't a significant factor. My grandmother lived to be 47 despite being affected, and she had 4 children. My great-aunt showed no symptoms at all and lived a normal lifespan. But recent research suggests the curse may be becoming more aggressive with each generation." Harry studied her face, noting the careful control she was maintaining over her emotions. "You're terrified." "I'm 11 years old and I might be dying," she said, with a bitter laugh that sounded far too mature for her age. "Of course I'm terrified." Without thinking, Harry moved around the table to sit beside her, pulling her into an awkward but heartfelt hug. She stiffened initially, then relaxed against him, and he realized this might be the first time anyone had simply held her while she processed the magnitude of her situation. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Contract or no contract, curse or no curse. We're in this together." "You don't understand what you're saying," Daphne protested, though she made no move to pull away from his embrace. "If the curse manifests severely, our marriage would be brief and tragic. You'd be left widowed before you turn 25, with the responsibility of carrying on both the Potter and Greengrass family legacies alone. "Then we'll make whatever time we have count," Harry said simply. "And if you're not affected by the curse, we'll have our whole lives ahead of us. Either way, I'd rather face it with you than spend the next 4 years wondering what might have been." Daphne finally pulled back to look at him directly. "Why?" "You barely know me. You could break the contract, find someone else. Someone without the shadow of an ancestral curse hanging over them." Harry considered the question seriously. "A month ago, I would have agreed with you. I didn't choose this arrangement, and I didn't choose you. But now," he paused, trying to find the right words, "now I can't imagine navigating this world without you. You've taught me about my family's history, about pure blood customs, about politics and traditions I never knew existed. But more than that, you've been honest with me about everything, even when it was difficult or frightening. That honesty is exactly why I'm telling you about the curse," she pointed out. "I know, and it's exactly why I'm choosing to stay." Harry reached for her hands again. "Besides, we're both still children. We have years to figure out how to deal with this, and years to learn more about potential treatments or ways to manage the curse if it does manifest." Daphne seemed to consider this, her composure slowly returning. "The curse specialists at St. Mungo's are still researching our bloodline. New treatments are being developed all the time, and as you said, there's a significant chance I won't be affected at all. There's also a chance that even if you are affected, it will be mild enough to manage," Harry added hopefully. "Your grandmother lived to 47 and had 4 children. That's not exactly a death sentence." "No," Daphne agreed with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all evening. "It's not ideal, but it's not hopeless either." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the gravity of their conversation settling around them. Harry realized that this revelation had fundamentally changed their relationship. What had begun as a political arrangement and evolved into a friendship was now something deeper, a partnership forged by shared uncertainty and mutual trust. "Does anyone else at Hogwarts know about the curse?" he asked. "A few of the older pure-blood students might know the family history," Daphne replied. "But the specific details about my potential manifestation are known only to my immediate family, and now you. I'd prefer to keep it that way for now." "Of course. But Daphne, you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. Whatever happens, whatever we learn about the curse over the next few years, we'll face it together." "Together," she repeated, as though testing the word. "I've been preparing for this my entire life, but I never expected to have a true partner in dealing with it." "Well, now you do," Harry said firmly. "For better or worse, in sickness and in health, right?" Daphne's laugh was watery but genuine. "Those are wedding vows, Harry. We're not married yet." "Maybe not officially," he replied, "but I think we just made a commitment that's more meaningful than any formal ceremony." As they gathered the books on blood maledictions and prepared to return to their dormitories, Harry reflected on how much their relationship had changed in the space of a single conversation. The theoretical future they had been carefully negotiating had suddenly become intensely personal and urgently real. The girl walking beside him through the castle corridors was no longer just his contractual fiancée or his guide to the pure-blood world. She was Daphne, brave, intelligent, and possibly doomed, and he was determined to stand by her whatever the future might bring. The curse that threatened to cut their time short had paradoxically made that time infinitely more precious. Whether they would have 4 years or 40, Harry knew with certainty that he wanted to spend them with the girl who had trusted him with her deepest fears and darkest secrets. The marriage contract that had once felt like a burden now felt like a lifeline, a promise that neither of them would have to face the uncertain future alone. The December snow had transformed Hogwarts into a winter wonderland, but the atmosphere in the Slytherin common room remained as politically charged as ever. Harry sat near the fireplace with his fellow first-years, ostensibly working on a transfiguration essay, but actually listening to the complex web of conversations that revealed the social hierarchies he was still learning to navigate. "Potter," Draco Malfoy said, settling into the chair across from him, with the casual arrogance that Harry had come to recognize as his default demeanor. "I've been meaning to ask you about your arrangement with Greengrass. My father finds it quite interesting." Harry looked up from his essay, noting that the other first-years had gone conspicuously quiet. Theodore Nott continued reading his Defense Against the Dark Arts textbook, but his posture suggested he was listening intently. Pansy Parkinson made no pretense of working, watching the conversation with obvious fascination. Even Blaise Zabini, who typically remained aloof from such discussions, seemed to be paying attention. "Interesting how?" Harry asked carefully. Draco leaned forward, his grey eyes bright with curiosity. "Well, it's quite a coup for the Greengrass family, isn't it? Securing an alliance with the Potter name, especially after your heroic defeat of you-know-who. It positions them very favorably for the future." "I don't think it's quite that calculated," Harry replied, remembering his conversations with Daphne about their father's wartime motivations. "Oh, but it is," Draco insisted, with the confidence of someone who had been raised in this world from birth. "Everything is calculated in pure blood politics. Take my own family's situation, for instance. The Malfoys have spent years rebuilding our reputation after the war ended badly for our associates. A marriage alliance with the boy who lived would have been invaluable for us as well." Theodore finally looked up from his book. "The Nott family received inquiries," he said quietly. "After your sorting became public knowledge, several families began reconsidering their long-term strategies." "Inquiries about what?" Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew. "About whether your contract with the Greengrass family was truly binding," Theodore explained. "Whether there might be opportunities for other arrangements." Harry felt a flash of irritation. "I'm not a commodity to be traded between families." "Aren't you?" Pansy interjected, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than malice. "I mean, that's essentially what pure-blood marriage contracts are. Strategic alliances that benefit both families involved. The fact that you're the most famous wizard of our generation just makes you a particularly valuable asset." "Pansy," Blaise said mildly from his position near the window. "Perhaps asset isn't the most diplomatic term." "But it's accurate," she replied with characteristic bluntness. "Harry brings fame, heroic status, and the Potter family fortune to any marriage alliance. Daphne brings ancient bloodlines, sacred 28 status, and significant political connections. It's actually quite a well-matched arrangement from a strategic perspective." Harry looked around at his housemates, struck by how naturally they discussed marriage and politics as intertwined concepts. "Is that really how you all see relationships? As strategic alliances?" "How else would we see them?" Draco asked, seeming genuinely puzzled by the question. "Love is all well and good for romantic novels, but real marriages require compatibility of goals, similar social standing, and mutual benefit to both families. Emotion is unreliable. It changes, it fades, it can be influenced by external factors. But shared interests and complementary strengths form the foundation of lasting partnerships." Theodore nodded in agreement. My parents have been married for 15 years, and they have tremendous respect for each other. They share similar values, they work together to advance our family's interests, and they've created a stable environment for their children. They might not have married for passionate love, but they've built something meaningful together. But what if you fall in love with someone your family doesn't approve of? Harry asked. Then you have a choice to make, Blaise said thoughtfully. Follow your heart and potentially lose your family's support and social standing, or honor your obligations and find other ways to achieve happiness. Most pure-blood heirs choose family loyalty over personal inclination. That seems, Harry struggled for the right word, limiting. It's practical, Pansy corrected. Passionate love affairs burn bright and often burn out quickly. Arranged marriages based on mutual respect and shared goals tend to be more stable long-term. Besides, she added with a slight smile, there's nothing preventing love from developing within an arranged marriage. Some of the strongest relationships I know began as family arrangements. Draco leaned back in his chair, studying Harry with calculating eyes. The real question is whether you and Greengrass are developing that kind of connection. You spend enough time together, and you certainly seem comfortable with each other. Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks. We're trying to get to know each other properly. If we're going to be bound by this contract, we want to make it work. Admirable, Theodore said approvingly. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about how you're navigating the cultural differences. You were raised by Muggles, while Daphne has been immersed in pure-blood society since birth. That must create some interesting challenges. It does, Harry admitted. I'm still learning about customs and expectations that she takes for granted. But she's been patient about explaining things, and I'm trying to adapt. What's the most difficult aspect? Blaise asked, and Harry was struck by the genuine interest in his voice. Despite his usual aloofness, Blaise seemed to be approaching this conversation as an intellectual exercise rather than idle gossip. Harry considered the question seriously. The politics, I think. The way every interaction has multiple layers of meaning. The way family histories influence present relationships. The constant awareness of how actions might affect family reputation. In the Muggle world, 11-year-olds don't typically worry about political implications of their friendships. They do in our world, Pansy said matter-of-factly. I've been taught since childhood that my choices reflect on the Parkinson family name. Every friendship, every academic achievement, every public appearance is evaluated in terms of how it affects our family's standing in wizarding society. That's a lot of pressure for children, Harry observed. It's preparation, Draco corrected. By the time we graduate from Hogwarts, we'll be expected to take active roles in managing family businesses, serving on various boards and committees, and eventually training our own children for similar responsibilities. The social skills we're learning now are essential for those future roles. Theodore closed his book and joined the conversation more fully. The pressure is significant, but it also provides structure and purpose. I know what's expected of me, what kind of future I'm working toward, and what skills I need to develop. There's something comforting about having a clear path forward. Even if it's a path chosen by others? Harry asked. The broad outlines are chosen by others, Theodore acknowledged. But within those parameters, we still have choices. I can choose how to approach my responsibilities, what causes to support, what kind of leader I want to become. The framework is predetermined, but the details are up to me. Harry thought about this as he watched his housemates. They all seemed so confident about their places in the world, so comfortable with the expectations and limitations that defined their lives. He envied that certainty even as he questioned its cost. "What about you, Blaze?" Harry asked. "You've been quiet about your family's expectations." Blaze smiled slightly. "The Zabini family situation is unique. My mother has been widowed several times, each time inheriting significant wealth from her late husbands. I'm expected to eventually choose a career and a spouse that will enhance our family's reputation. But my mother's independence has given me more flexibility than most pure-blood heirs enjoy." "Several times?" Harry repeated, raising an eyebrow. "My mother has been quite unlucky in love," Blaze said with deadpan humor. "Her husband seemed to have a tendency toward unexpected accidents and sudden illnesses. Completely coincidental, of course." The implication hung in the air for a moment before Draco laughed. "I do love your family's approach to wealth accumulation, Zabini. Very efficient. We prefer to think of it as diversifying our assets through strategic personal investments," Blaze replied smoothly. Harry was beginning to understand that even casual conversations among his housemates were lessons in the complex dynamics of pure-blood society. Every family had its reputation, its strategies, its particular approach to maintaining and expanding power and influence. "Speaking of family strategies," Pansy said, turning back to Harry, "how is Greengrass handling the attention your arrangement has brought her? I imagine other families are watching your relationship quite closely." "She's handling it well," Harry replied. "Better than I am, probably. She's used to this kind of scrutiny." "The Greengrass family has always been skilled at navigating pure-blood politics," Draco acknowledged. "They managed to maintain their position during the war without making enemies on either side, which is no small achievement. Daphne was raised to handle exactly this kind of situation." "What about you?" Theodore asked Harry directly. "How are you adjusting to being watched and evaluated constantly?" Harry laughed ruefully. "I thought being the boy who lived was complicated, but that was just about my past. This is about my future, my choices, my relationships. Every conversation, every public interaction is being analyzed for political implications I don't even understand yet." "You'll learn," Blaze assured him. "And you have advantages that most of us don't. Your fame gives you a certain amount of protection. People are less likely to move against you directly because of your public status. And your Muggle upbringing, while it creates some challenges, also means you're not bound by the same assumptions and limitations that constrain those of us raised entirely within pure-blood society. That could be either an advantage or a liability, depending on how you use it," Pansy pointed out. "Innovation is valued in some circles, but tradition is highly prized in others." As the conversation continued around him, Harry reflected on how much his understanding of his position had evolved since his sorting. What had initially seemed like a simple house placement had revealed itself to be entry into a complex social and political ecosystem where every relationship carried implications beyond personal preference. His fellow Slytherins weren't just classmates. They were future colleagues, potential allies or rivals, heirs to families whose support or opposition could significantly impact his adult life. Learning to navigate these relationships successfully was apparently as important a part of his education as mastering spells or brewing potions. The fire crackled in the grate as their conversation wound down, each of them returning to their abandoned homework. But Harry continued to think about the insights his housemates had shared. Despite their youth, they possessed a sophistication about political and social dynamics that he was only beginning to appreciate. Whether he could successfully integrate himself into this world while maintaining his own values and identity remained to be seen. But conversations like this one gave him hope that he could find his place among these ambitious, calculating, and surprisingly supportive peers who were helping him understand the intricate game he had unknowingly joined when he chose the serpent over the lion. The library was nearly empty on this cold January afternoon, with most students either in their common rooms or outdoors enjoying the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Harry sat at a corner table, surrounded by several thick volumes on magical contracts and wizarding lore that Hermione Granger had helped him locate. The bushy-haired Gryffindor sat across from him, her quill scratching furiously as she took notes on everything they had discovered. "This is fascinating," Hermione said, looking up from a particularly dense legal text. "I had no idea that magical contracts could be so complex. Look at this. There are 17 different categories of binding agreements, each with their own enforcement mechanisms and escape clauses." Harry rubbed his tired eyes behind his glasses. They had been researching for over 2 hours, and his head was swimming with legal terminology and arcane, magical principles. "Have you found anything that might help with my situation?" "Several things, actually," Hermione replied, flipping through her notes. "Marriage contracts like yours fall under blood covenant classifications, which are among the most binding types of magical agreements. But there are precedents for modification or dissolution under certain circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Harry asked, leaning forward with interest. "Fundamental breach by either party, mutual consent of both families involved, or," Hermione paused, consulting her notes again, "or significant material change in circumstances that renders the original agreement contrary to the welfare of the contracted parties." "That last one is quite broad and could potentially apply to your situation." Harry considered this information carefully. "The problem is that I'm not sure I want to break the contract anymore. A few months ago, I would have been desperate for any way out. But now you've gotten to know Daphne Greengrass," Hermione observed with her typical directness. "I've noticed you two spend quite a bit of time together. More than the contract would strictly require." Before Harry could respond, the library doors opened and Ron Weasley trudged in, his red hair damp from melted snow and his expression troubled. He spotted them at their table and approached with obvious reluctance. "Harry," Ron said stiffly, nodding politely but without warmth. "Hermione said you wanted to talk to me about something." "Sit down, Ron," Harry said, gesturing to the empty chair beside Hermione. "I wanted to explain some things about my sorting and my situation with Daphne." Ron remained standing, his freckled face set in stubborn lines. "Not much to explain, is there? You chose Slytherin over Gryffindor. You chose pure-blood politics over—" he gestured vaguely, "over whatever we might have been." The hurt in Ron's voice was unmistakable, and Harry felt a pang of guilt. In the month since his sorting, he had largely focused on integrating himself into Slytherin House and building his relationship with Daphne. He had not given enough thought to the friendships he might have formed in Gryffindor. "It wasn't that simple," Harry said quietly. "I didn't choose Slytherin to reject Gryffindor or to reject you. I made a strategic decision based on circumstances you don't fully understand." "Enlighten me then," Ron challenged, finally taking the offered seat but maintaining his defensive posture. Harry glanced around the library to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then began explaining the marriage contract and its implications. Ron's expression shifted from hurt to confusion to dawning understanding as Harry described the wartime context, his father's motivations, and the political realities he was learning to navigate. "So you're telling me," Ron said slowly, "that you chose your house based on some contract your father signed before you could even walk?" "I chose my house based on trying to honor my father's intentions while building the best possible future for myself," Harry corrected. "The contract was part of that, but so was understanding where I could have the most influence in wizarding society." Ron shook his head in disbelief. "Mate, you sound like a Malfoy when you talk like that. Political influence, And strategic decisions? That's not how normal people think about friendships and marriages. But Harry isn't normal people, Hermione interjected gently. He's the boy who lived, heir to an ancient pure-blood family, and whether he likes it or not, a significant political figure. The choices available to him are different from the choices available to us. That doesn't mean he has to like it, Ron grumbled. But his hostility was beginning to fade into reluctant acceptance. The library doors opened again, and Neville Longbottom entered, looking around nervously before spotting their table. He approached with the hesitant manner that Harry had noticed characterized most of his interactions with other students. "Sorry I'm late," Neville said, settling into the remaining chair. Professor Sprout needed help with some devil's snare that was getting aggressive. "Neville," Harry said gratefully, "I was hoping you could help Ron understand why I made the choices I did. You know better than most what it's like to have family expectations and pure blood pressures." Neville nodded seriously. "My grandmother has very definite ideas about what's appropriate for the Longbottom heir. She's been negotiating potential marriage contracts for me since I was 9 years old." Ron's eyes widened. "You too? But your parents are... they can't exactly. They can't participate in the negotiations," Neville said quietly. "But that doesn't mean the family obligations disappear. If anything, Gran feels more pressure to ensure I make advantageous alliances to help restore the family's position after what happened to my parents." Hermione leaned forward with interest. "How do you handle that pressure? The expectation that your personal choices should serve family interests?" "I try to find ways to honor both," Neville replied thoughtfully. "I can't ignore my responsibilities to my family name, but I also can't live my entire life based solely on what others expect. It's a balance." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do," Harry said, looking meaningfully at Ron. "I'm not abandoning my own values or ignoring my own preferences. I'm trying to find a path that honors both my family's legacy and my personal happiness." Ron was quiet for a long moment, processing this explanation. "And you think Daphne Greengrass is that path?" "I think she might be," Harry admitted. "We've become close over the past few months. She's intelligent, honest about difficult things, and she understands the world I'm entering in ways that I'm still learning. More than that, I genuinely enjoy spending time with her." "That's important," Neville agreed. "From what I've observed, you two seem to have developed real respect for each other. That's more than many arranged marriages start with." Hermione consulted her research notes again. "Speaking of your situation, Neville, there's something Harry and I discovered that you should know about. It relates to the prophecy that was made around the time you were both born." Neville's face went pale. "What prophecy?" Harry exchanged glances with Hermione, then carefully explained what Daphne had told him about the prophecy concerning a child born at the end of July 1980 to parents who had thrice defied Voldemort. Neville listened with growing horror as the implications became clear. "So Voldemort could have chosen either of us," Neville said faintly. "If my birthday had been a day later, or if my parents had been slightly less prominent in their opposition." "Yes," Harry said gently. "It could have been you instead of me. Your parents could have been the ones targeted for murder, and you could have been the one marked as the boy who lived." "But they weren't murdered," Neville said with quiet pain. "They were tortured into insanity instead. Sometimes I wonder if that wasn't worse." Ron shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly out of his depth with this level of serious family trauma. Hermione reached across the table to squeeze Neville's hand sympathetically. "The point is," Harry continued, "that both of our lives have been shaped by forces beyond our control. The difference is that you're dealing with family expectations while trying to cope with your parents' condition, while I'm dealing with fame and a marriage contract. Neither of us has the luxury of making purely personal choices." "I suppose that's true," Ron said slowly. "I mean, my family has expectations too, but they're more about staying out of trouble and maybe finding decent jobs after Hogwarts. Nothing like what you two are dealing with." "That doesn't make your choices less important," Hermione pointed out. "It just means you have different kinds of freedom and different kinds of responsibility." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several older students looking for study space. As they gathered their books and prepared to leave, Ron turned to Harry with an expression of grudging understanding. "Look, I still think you're making everything more complicated than it needs to be," Ron said. "But I'm beginning to see why you felt like Slytherin was your best option. And if Daphne Greengrass makes you happy—" "She does," Harry said, with certainty that surprised even him. "Or at least, she makes me feel like happiness is possible, even within the constraints I'm working with." "Then I suppose that's what matters," Ron concluded. "Though I still say you're mental for choosing the dungeons over Gryffindor Tower." Harry laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "The dungeons aren't so bad once you get used to them, and the company is better than you might expect." As they left the library together, Harry reflected on how this conversation had helped clarify his own feelings about the path he had chosen. Ron's initial hurt and confusion had forced him to articulate why he believed his decisions were right, while Neville's understanding had reminded him that he wasn't alone in facing difficult family obligations. The friendship he might have had with Ron in Gryffindor would have been simpler, more straightforward, based on shared experiences and common interests. The relationship they were building now across house lines was more complex, requiring constant effort to bridge the gap between their different worlds and expectations. But perhaps that complexity wasn't necessarily a bad thing. His relationship with Daphne was also complex, requiring constant negotiation and mutual understanding. His position in Slytherin House demanded political awareness and strategic thinking that he had never needed before. The simple friendships and uncomplicated choices he might have enjoyed in Gryffindor were probably illusions anyway. As the boy who lived and the Potter heir, he would always have been dealing with fame, expectations, and political implications. At least in Slytherin, those realities were acknowledged openly rather than ignored or minimized. Walking back toward the castle with Hermione chattering about magical contract law, Ron grumbling about the cold, and Neville quietly contemplating family obligations they all shared, Harry felt grateful for friends who were willing to accept the complexity of his situation, even when they didn't fully understand it. The path he had chosen was not easy, but with friends who supported him and a partner who understood him, it was beginning to feel like it might lead somewhere worthwhile. Whether that destination would be happiness, fulfillment, or merely successful navigation of political necessity remained to be seen. But for the first time since learning about his betrothal, Harry felt optimistic about finding out. The February evening found Harry and Daphne in a secluded alcove of the castle, away from the bustle of the common rooms and the ever-present scrutiny of their housemates. Daphne had brought with her an ornate leather portfolio that Harry had never seen before, its silver clasps bearing the Greengrass family crest. "I thought it was time you understood the full scope of our family's connections," she said, opening the portfolio to reveal an intricate family tree that sprawled across several large parchments. "Particularly our relationship to the Black family and their various branches." Harry studied the elaborate diagram, noting how names were connected by delicate lines indicating marriages, blood relations, and political alliances. The Black family tree dominated the center of the chart, with dozens of branches extending to other prominent pureblood houses. The Blacks are related to nearly every significant wizarding family in Britain, Daphne explained, tracing the connections with her finger. They've been the architects of pure-blood intermarriage for generations, creating a network of alliances that spans the entire magical aristocracy. "Including your family?" Harry asked, following one of the lines that led from the black tree to a smaller section labelled Greengrass. "My great-grandmother was a Black before she married," Daphne confirmed. "Lycoris Black, sister to Arcturus Black, who was the grandfather of Sirius and Regulus. That makes me a third cousin to the current Black heirs, though the connection is distant enough to be largely ceremonial." Harry found Sirius's name on the chart, noting how it was connected to dozens of other families through various relationships. "I met Sirius Black briefly before term started," he said. "Hagrid mentioned he was my father's best friend." "He was," Daphne agreed, though his relationship with his own family was complicated. Sirius Black was disowned by his parents for opposing their political views and refusing to embrace the pure-blood supremacy ideology that the Blacks traditionally supported. She pointed to another section of the family tree, where several names were marked with small symbols indicating their current status. The Black sisters provide an interesting case study in how these family connections work in practice. Bellatrix married Rodolphus Lestrange, cementing an alliance between two of the most militant pure-blood families. Andromeda was disowned for marrying a Muggle-born wizard, and Narcissa married Lucius Malfoy, creating the most politically advantageous match of the three. "Politically advantageous how?" Harry asked. "The Malfoy family had wealth and influence that complemented the Black family's ancient prestige," Daphne explained. "Lucius Malfoy was positioned to become a major power broker in the Ministry, while Narcissa brought the social connections and bloodline credentials that enhanced his political ambitions. Together, they created one of the most formidable couples in wizarding society." Harry studied Narcissa's entry on the family tree, noting her birth year of 1955 and her current status as Draco's mother. "What does she think of my contract with your family?" Daphne smiled slightly. "Actually, I can tell you that directly. She sent my mother a letter just after Christmas, offering her congratulations on the alliance and expressing hope that our family's connection would prove as beneficial as her own marriage to Lucius." "She approved?" "More than approved. She was impressed. According to her letter, the strategic value of connecting the Greengrass bloodline to the Potter name was inspired political maneuvering that would serve both families well in the post-war social reconstruction." Harry winced at the clinical language. "Does everyone in your world think of marriage in terms of political maneuvering?" "The adults do," Daphne said honestly, "though that doesn't mean they ignore the importance of personal compatibility. Narcissa and Lucius genuinely seem to care for each other, despite the political foundations of their relationship. My parents have developed real affection over their 17 years of marriage. Arranged marriages can become love matches, given time and mutual respect." She turned to another section of the family tree, this one darker and more troubling. "Of course, not all Black family marriages have been successful. Bellatrix Lestrange represents the other extreme. A woman who chose ideology over everything else, including basic humanity." Harry followed Daphne's finger to Bellatrix's name, noting the dark symbols that marked her as a convicted criminal. "She was involved in torturing Neville's parents, wasn't she?" "She led the attack," Daphne said grimly. "Along with her husband Rodolphus, his brother Rabaston, and Bartemius Crouch Jr. She tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom with the Cruciatus curse until they lost their sanity. They were searching for information about you-know-who's whereabouts after his defeat, but the Longbottoms knew nothing useful." The weight of this information settled over Harry like a cold blanket. And she's related to our families through these marriage connections? Distantly, yes. The pure blood world is small enough that most of us are related to each other in some way. The question is whether you embrace those connections or distance yourself from the more unsavory relatives. Daphne pointed to another name on the chart. For instance, my family maintains cordial relations with Narcissa Malfoy despite her husband's suspected Death Eater connections. But we've never had any contact with Bellatrix Lestrange, even before she was imprisoned. Harry studied the complex web of relationships, beginning to understand how every marriage and alliance rippled through the entire pure blood community. How do families navigate these connections when some relatives end up on opposite sides of conflicts? Very carefully, Daphne replied. During the war, families had to choose sides, but they also had to consider which relatives they might need to maintain relationships with, regardless of political differences. It's one reason why neutrality was such a valuable position. It allowed families to preserve connections across political divides. Is that why your family stayed neutral, to preserve these relationships? Partly, she admitted, but also because my grandfather genuinely believed that the pure blood community's long-term survival depended on avoiding the kind of devastating internal conflicts that the war represented. He thought that tearing apart these family networks would ultimately weaken everyone. Harry considered this perspective as he continued studying the family tree. What about now? How do these connections affect our contract? Daphne traced several lines connecting their families to various other pure blood houses. Our marriage would strengthen existing alliances while creating new ones. The Potter name is respected even by families who disagreed with your parents' politics, because your defeat of you-know-who ended a conflict that was destroying the entire community. Connecting that prestige to the Greengrass family's network of relationships creates opportunities for influence and cooperation that neither family could achieve alone. Opportunities for what, specifically? Political influence, business partnerships, social positioning, all the things that matter for maintaining family status over generations. She showed him a section of the chart that highlighted various business connections and ministry positions held by family members. For instance, Narcissa's cousin works in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Her brother-in-law has connections in the International Confederation of Wizards. These relationships matter when you need permits, information, or favorable treatment from government agencies. Harry felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was learning. So every decision I make doesn't just affect me and you, it potentially affects dozens of families and hundreds of relationships. Now you're beginning to understand, Daphne said with approval. This is why arranged marriages make sense in our world. Individual preferences are important, but they have to be balanced against the broader implications for extended family networks and long-term political stability. That's a lot of pressure for two 11-year-olds. It is, she agreed, but it's also an opportunity. Most people our age have no influence over these kinds of high-level political and social dynamics. Because of our unusual circumstances, we're being introduced to this world much earlier than normal. That knowledge could be valuable as we get older. Harry studied a section of the family tree that showed several recent marriages and their political implications. Have you thought about what kind of influence we might want to have? What we'd want to accomplish with these connections? Daphne was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think about it constantly, she finally said. The pure blood world has traditions and customs that are worth preserving, but it also has problems that need to be addressed. The kind of extremism that Bellatrix Lestrange represented, the willingness to torture innocent people for political gain, that has to be prevented from happening again. How would we do that? By building bridges instead of walls, by using family connections to promote cooperation rather than conflict, by demonstrating that pure blood traditions can coexist with more progressive values. She looked at him directly. Your unique position, famous for defeating a Dark Lord, but choosing to integrate into traditional pure-blood society, could be incredibly powerful for promoting that kind of balance. Harry considered this possibility as they continued reviewing the family connections. The idea that his personal choices could have broader political implications was both exciting and terrifying, but it also gave meaning to the constraints and obligations he was learning to navigate. What would Narcissa Malfoy think about that kind of approach? He asked. I think she would approve, Daphne said thoughtfully. From what I understand about her, she's pragmatic above all else. She wants her family to be successful and secure. If promoting cooperation and stability serves those goals better than promoting conflict and division, she would support it. And what about the other families? The ones who were more directly involved in supporting Voldemort? They'll be watching to see what direction the post-war pure-blood community takes, Daphne replied. If we can demonstrate that there's a path forward that preserves their core interests while rejecting the extremism that led to disaster, many of them would probably embrace that approach. As they gathered up the family trees and prepared to return to their respective dormitories, Harry reflected on how much his understanding of his situation had evolved. What had begun as a personal arrangement between two families was beginning to look like an opportunity to influence the direction of an entire social and political system. The responsibilities that came with that opportunity were daunting, but they were also motivating. If he and Daphne could successfully navigate their own relationship while building broader alliances and promoting constructive change, they might be able to help ensure that the wizarding world never again descended into the kind of conflict that had torn it apart during his childhood. Walking through the castle corridors with Daphne beside him, Harry felt a new sense of purpose about the path he had chosen. The marriage contract that had once felt like a burden was beginning to look like a platform for meaningful influence. Whether he and Daphne could live up to that potential remained to be seen. But for the first time, Harry was excited to find out. The March wind rattled the windows of the abandoned classroom where Harry and Daphne had taken refuge with an armload of legal texts borrowed from the restricted section. Professor McGonagall had granted them special permission to research magical contracts for what they had described as a family history project, though Harry suspected she knew more about their true situation than she let on. According to this, Daphne said, looking up from a particularly thick volume titled Magical Contracts and Their Enforcement, your father absolutely had the legal authority to enter into binding agreements on your behalf. As your magical guardian and head of the Potter family, James Potter could make contracts that would remain valid even after his death. Harry rubbed his tired eyes behind his glasses. They had been researching for hours, and every text they consulted seemed to confirm that his options were more limited than he had hoped. But surely there are exceptions, ways to challenge contracts that were made under duress or circumstances that have changed significantly. There are, Daphne agreed, turning to a bookmarked page. But most of them require either mutual consent from both families involved, or proof that the contract was made fraudulently or under magical coercion. The fact that your father signed our contract during wartime when making strategic alliances was both reasonable and necessary actually strengthens its legal foundation rather than weakening it. Harry stood and paced to the window, staring out at the grounds where students were enjoying the first warm day of spring. What about the fact that I was raised by Muggles, that I had no knowledge of magical customs or pure blood traditions. Surely that counts as a significant change in circumstances. I wondered about that too, Daphne replied, consulting another text. But according to wizarding law and pure blood customs, the magical status and bloodline of the contracted parties are what matter, not their upbringing or cultural knowledge. The law assumes that proper education in magical customs can be provided after the fact, but fundamental magical heritage cannot be changed. The weight of this information settled over Harry like a suffocating blanket. So no matter what I think or feel about this arrangement, no matter how my circumstances have changed, the contract remains binding. Not necessarily, Daphne said carefully. There is one avenue we haven't fully explored yet. She opened a different book. This one focused specifically on magical contract dissolution. Contracts can be challenged on the grounds of fundamental incompatibility that would cause harm to one or both parties. But the standards for proving such incompatibility are quite stringent. Harry returned to his seat, leaning forward with interest. What kind of standards? The challenging party would need to demonstrate that fulfilling the contract would cause genuine magical, physical, or psychological harm that outweighs the benefits and protections the contract was designed to provide. Daphne read from the text carefully. The Wizengamot would appoint neutral assessors to evaluate the relationship, the family circumstances, and the potential consequences of both upholding and dissolving the contract. That sounds invasive, Harry observed. It is, she confirmed. The process typically takes months, or even years, during which both families' reputations and social standings are subject to intense scrutiny. Most families prefer to negotiate private modifications to contracts rather than risk the public exposure that formal challenges require. Harry considered this information as he watched Daphne continue reading. Her composed demeanor hadn't changed, but he noticed that her hands were gripping the book more tightly than usual, and her voice carried a slight tension that suggested this conversation was more difficult for her than she was letting on. "Daphne," he said gently, "how do you feel about all of this? About the possibility that we might find a way to challenge or dissolve the contract?" She looked up from the book, and for a moment her careful composure slipped. "Honestly, I'm not sure I want to know the answer to that question." "Why not?" She closed the book and set it aside, meeting his eyes directly. "Because if we found a way to dissolve the contract, and you chose to take it, I think I would be devastated." The honesty of her admission hung in the air between them. Harry felt his heart skip a beat as he processed what she had just revealed. "When this all started," Daphne continued quietly, "I thought of it as a duty I would need to fulfill, an arrangement that I could learn to tolerate, maybe even find some satisfaction in, if we were compatible enough. But these past few months—" "What about these past few months?" Harry asked, though he thought he already knew what she was going to say. "These past few months, I've realized that somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as my contractual obligation, and started thinking of you as someone I care about, someone I look forward to spending time with, someone whose opinions matter to me, whose happiness affects my own." Harry reached across the table to take her hands in his. "Daphne, I know it's foolish," she interrupted, pulling her hands away and standing to pace around the room. "I know that what we have is built on arrangements made by other people, for reasons that had nothing to do with our personal feelings. I know that any affection I've developed might be nothing more than a response to spending time together under unusual circumstances." "That's not true," Harry said firmly. "Isn't it?" she challenged, turning to face him. How can either of us be sure that what we feel is genuine when we've never had the opportunity to develop feelings naturally, when we've been told from the beginning that we're supposed to end up together? Harry stood as well, moving to where she stood by the window. Because I've had the opportunity to compare. I've spent time with Hermione, with other girls in our year, with students from different houses. None of those interactions have felt like what I feel when I'm with you. And what do you feel when you're with me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harry took a moment to consider his answer carefully. Safe. Understood. Like I can be myself without having to explain or justify or perform. Like we're partners working toward something meaningful together, rather than just two people trying to get through school. Daphne's composure finally cracked, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. That's what I feel too, she admitted. But what if we're wrong? What if we're just convincing ourselves that we care about each other because the alternative is too frightening to consider? Then we'd be making the same mistake that millions of people throughout history have made, Harry replied. The mistake of falling in love. Contract or no contract, arranged marriage or free choice, people have been struggling with these same questions forever. But most people have the luxury of finding out gradually, without the pressure of knowing that their entire future depends on getting the answer right, Daphne pointed out. Harry moved closer, gently wiping the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. Maybe that pressure isn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it's forced us to be more honest with each other, more intentional about building something real than we would have been otherwise. You really believe that? I'm starting to, he replied. When I think about dissolving the contract, about walking away from this arrangement, the idea doesn't make me feel relieved or free. It makes me feel like I'd be losing something precious before I even had a chance to fully appreciate it. Daphne leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. So where does that leave us? We've spent hours researching ways to challenge the contract, only to discover that we're not sure we want to use them. It leaves us with a choice, Harry said thoughtfully. We can continue to think of ourselves as bound by an arrangement made by other people, or we can choose to stay together because it's what we want. What's the difference? Agency, Harry replied. The difference between accepting our situation because we have no choice and embracing it because we've decided it's what we want our future to look like. Daphne opened her eyes and studied his face carefully. And what do you want our future to look like? Harry considered the question seriously. I want it to look like a partnership between equals, two people who respect each other, support each other's goals, and find ways to be happy together even when the circumstances are complicated. I want it to look like what we've been building at these past few months, but with the knowledge that we're choosing it rather than simply accepting it. That sounds nice, Daphne said with a tentative smile. Scary, but nice. Why scary? Because it means taking responsibility for our own happiness rather than blaming our circumstances if things don't work out, she explained. If we choose this and it goes badly, we can't claim that we were just victims of an unfair system. Harry nodded, understanding her concern. But if we choose this and it goes well, we'll know that we built something meaningful together. Something that belongs to us, regardless of how it started. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the weight of what they had discovered about both the legal constraints they faced and their own feelings about those constraints. So what do we do now? Daphne finally asked. Now we stop researching ways to escape the contract and start focusing on ways to make it work, Harry replied. Not because we have to, but because we want to." "You're sure?" Harry smiled, feeling more certain than he had about anything since learning about the magical world. "I'm sure. The question is whether you're sure." Daphne was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then she smiled back, and Harry saw a new kind of confidence in her expression. Not the careful composure she usually maintained, but genuine certainty about her own feelings and choices. "I'm sure too," she said. "Whatever happens over the next 6 years, whatever challenges we face, or changes we go through, I want to face them with you. Not because of a contract our parents signed, but because I can't imagine wanting to face them with anyone else." As they gathered up the legal texts and prepared to return them to the restricted section, Harry reflected on how much this conversation had changed his perspective on their situation. The research that had begun as an attempt to find escape routes had instead revealed that their strongest bond wasn't magical or legal. It was the genuine affection and respect they had developed for each other. The contract would always be part of their story, but it no longer felt like the most important part. What mattered now was what they chose to build together, day by day, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. The future they were working toward wasn't one that had been imposed on them by their parents' wartime fears and strategic calculations. It was one they were creating together, based on their own hopes and shared determination to find happiness within the circumstances life had given them. The late April afternoon found Harry and Daphne seated by the lake, having escaped the stuffy castle for the first truly warm day of spring. Harry's Transfiguration textbook lay forgotten beside him as he watched Daphne carefully arrange a collection of smooth stones she had gathered from the shoreline, each one placed with precise attention to size, color, and texture. "It's called a meditation circle," she explained, noticing his curious expression. "My mother taught me the technique when I was 7. It helps with concentration and emotional regulation. Useful skills for navigating pure-blood social gatherings where every word and gesture is analyzed for political significance." Harry picked up one of the unused stones, rolling it between his fingers. "That sounds exhausting, having to monitor yourself constantly." "It is," Daphne agreed, adjusting the position of a particularly smooth grey stone. "But it also becomes second nature after a while. The meditation helps me find a calm center before difficult conversations or public appearances. Would you like me to show you?" "Actually, yes," Harry said, setting aside his textbook entirely. "I could use help with that. Every time someone recognizes me as the boy who lived, I never know how to respond. Half the time I end up saying something awkward or disappointing people who expect me to be more heroic, I suppose." Daphne smiled and gestured for him to sit facing her with the circle of stones between them. "The key is to remember that you can't control other people's expectations or reactions. You can only control your own responses. Focus on the stones, their weight, their texture, the way the light hits their surfaces." Harry followed her guidance, surprised by how quickly the simple exercise began to calm his mind. "Where did your mother learn this technique?" "From her grandmother, who learned it from hers. It's been passed down through the women in our family for generations, though it's not something we typically share outside the family." Daphne paused in her arrangement. "I'm sharing it with you because I want you to have tools that help you handle the pressures you're facing." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Harry more than he had expected. "Thank you. That means a lot." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the tension Harry hadn't even realized he was carrying beginning to ease from his shoulders. A group of older students passed by, and Harry noticed how naturally Daphne nodded to them, with just the right degree of acknowledgement. Friendly but not overly familiar, confident but not arrogant. "How do you do that?" he asked once the students had moved on. "Know exactly how to act with everyone?" "Years of practice and observation," Daphne replied. "Pure blood society has very specific rules about social interactions, but they're not arbitrary. They're designed to maintain respect and avoid unnecessary conflicts. Watch. See those third-year Ravenclaws approaching?" Harry looked where she indicated and saw a group of students from another house walking along the lake shore. "Yes. They're not pure blood, so the formal protocols don't apply, but they're older students, which creates a different dynamic. And one of them is a prefect. See the badge?" Harry nodded. "So I'll acknowledge them politely, but won't initiate conversation unless they do. It shows respect for their authority, without overstepping social boundaries." Sure enough, the Ravenclaws passed by with friendly nods, and one of them, the prefect, paused to ask if they were enjoying the weather before moving on. "That was perfectly handled," Harry observed admiringly. "It becomes automatic after a while," Daphne said. "Though I have to admit, it's refreshing to spend time with someone who doesn't already know all these rules. You ask questions about things I take for granted, which makes me think more carefully about why we do what we do." Harry settled back against a tree, watching as Daphne completed her stone arrangement. "What else do you do for fun, beyond meditation and social navigation?" "I read," she said immediately. "Not just textbooks or family histories, but novels and poetry and theoretical magical texts that have nothing to do with my studies. And I collect interesting magical artifacts, small things that most people wouldn't consider valuable, but that have unusual properties or fascinating histories." "What kind of artifacts?" Daphne reached into her bag and withdrew a small silver pendant that caught the sunlight in an intriguing way. "This is a mood pendant from the 15th century. It changes color based on the wearer's emotional state, but only for people with certain magical signatures. Most people think it's just decorative jewelry." Harry examined the pendant carefully. In his hands, it remained silver, but when Daphne took it back, it shifted to a warm, golden hue. "That's brilliant. Where did you find it?" "A shop in Diagon Alley that specializes in overlooked magical items. The proprietor didn't realize what it was. She thought the color changes were random. But I've been researching the craftsman who made it, and his work always had specific purposes." Daphne's eyes lit up as she spoke about her research, and Harry found himself genuinely interested in learning more. "Do you have others?" "Several," she said, returning the pendant to her bag. "A quill that only writes true statements. It simply stops working if you try to write lies with it. A small mirror that shows not your current appearance, but how you appeared at your happiest moment. A compass that points not north, but toward whatever you most need to find." "Those sound incredibly useful," Harry said, "and fascinating from a magical theory perspective. Have you shown them to any of our professors?" "Professor Flitwick might be interested," Daphne mused. "Though I'm always careful about revealing family possessions. Some magical artifacts can be politically sensitive." Harry understood her caution. "What about you?" Daphne asked. "What do you do when you're not thinking about marriage contracts and pure-blood politics?" "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out," Harry admitted. "I spent so many years with the Dursleys where I wasn't allowed to show interest in anything, and then this year has been so overwhelming with learning about magic and my family history. But I think I like flying. We haven't had proper flying lessons yet, but I enjoyed the demonstration Madame Hooch gave us." Flying is wonderful, Daphne agreed. My father taught me when I was 8, though Mother worried constantly about injuries that might affect future marriage prospects. She rolled her eyes at the memory. Pure-blood daughters are expected to be accomplished but not reckless. That seems like an impossible balance. It is, sometimes. I'm expected to be intelligent but not intimidating, capable but not independent, interesting but not challenging to male egos. It's exhausting trying to calibrate yourself to meet all those expectations simultaneously. Harry considered this as he watched the late afternoon light play across the water. Is that why you're comfortable with me? Because I don't know all those expectations well enough to enforce them? Partly, Daphne said thoughtfully. But also because you seem to genuinely like the parts of me that I have to hide around other people. My curiosity, my research interests, my questions about why things are done certain ways. Most pure-blood boys our age would find those traits off-putting. I find them fascinating, Harry said honestly. You know so much about things I've never even heard of, but you explain them in ways that make me want to learn more, rather than feeling stupid for not already knowing. They were interrupted by the arrival of a small group of Slytherin students, including Draco Malfoy and Theodore Nott, who approached with the casual confidence that Harry was learning to recognize as standard pure-blood demeanor. Potter, Greengrass. Draco nodded to them both. Enjoying the weather? It's lovely, Daphne replied smoothly. How are your preparations for Professor Snape's essay going? Tediously, Theodore answered. Though I suppose that's the point of assignments on the legal classifications of potion ingredients. Mind if we join you? Harry noticed how naturally Daphne handled the social dynamics of the group's arrival, welcoming them warmly, but not abandoning her conversation with him, including the newcomers while maintaining the tone they had established. It was a skill he was beginning to appreciate more as he observed her navigate similar situations. We were discussing magical artifacts, Harry said, deciding to try applying some of Daphne's social techniques. Daphne has a fascinating collection of historical pieces. Really? Theodore perked up with genuine interest. I've been researching magical artifact authentication methods for a family project. What periods do you focus on? As Daphne launched into an explanation of her collection criteria and research methods, Harry watched the easy way she shifted between her relaxed personal conversation style with him and the more formal but still warm tone, appropriate for discussing academic interests with classmates. The transition was seamless, and he began to understand how she managed to be genuinely herself while still operating within the complex social structures of pure-blood society. That's impressive, Draco said when she finished describing her research on 15th-century craftsmen. My father might know some collectors who specialize in that period if you'd be interested in networking opportunities. I would, actually, Daphne replied. Thank you for thinking of it. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics from magical theory to Quidditch to speculation about their upcoming exams. Harry found himself enjoying the group dynamic more than he had expected, particularly as he began to understand the subtle ways that Daphne facilitated conversations and helped everyone feel included while maintaining the appropriate social protocols. As the sun began to set and they gathered their belongings to return to the castle, Harry reflected on how much his appreciation for Daphne had deepened over the afternoon. Her intelligence and curiosity, her thoughtfulness in sharing family techniques with him, her skill in navigating complex social situations, all of these qualities made her someone he genuinely enjoyed spending time with, regardless of any contractual obligations. Thank you, he said quietly as they walked back toward the castle, the others having dispersed to their various activities. For what? For sharing your meditation technique, for showing me your artifacts, for... for letting me see who you are when you're not worried about pure blood expectations," Harry said. "I feel like I understand you better as a person now, not just as my future wife." Daphne smiled, and Harry thought he saw genuine warmth in her expression. "I feel the same way about you. You're thoughtful and genuinely interested in learning, not just about magic, but about people and ideas. And you make me feel like it's safe to be curious and ask questions, even about things I'm supposed to already understand." Walking through the castle corridors with Daphne beside him, Harry felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with political arrangements or family obligations. He was spending time with someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed, someone who challenged him intellectually while helping him navigate unfamiliar social terrain, someone who was becoming a true friend in addition to being his intended partner. For the first time since learning about the marriage contract, Harry felt genuinely excited about the future they were building together, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The final weeks of Harry's first year at Hogwarts arrived with a mixture of anticipation and melancholy that seemed to permeate the entire castle. As May gave way to June, students began preparing for their end-of-year examinations, while simultaneously looking forward to the summer holidays that would separate them from friends and the magical world they had come to call home. For Harry, the approaching end of term carried additional weight. This had been the year that changed everything, the year he discovered not only that he was a wizard, but that his future had been carefully planned by parents he barely remembered. More importantly, it had been the year he met Daphne and began to understand what it might mean to build a life with someone who truly understood him. "I can't believe we're almost finished with our first year," Daphne said, as they sat in their favorite corner of the library, surrounded by notes and textbooks. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden light that made even their stacks of study materials look almost romantic. "It feels like we just arrived," Harry agreed, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. The nervous 11-year-old who had boarded the Hogwarts Express 9 months ago felt like a different person entirely. That boy had been overwhelmed by magic and fame and expectations he didn't understand. The young man sitting across from Daphne now felt confident in his magical abilities, secure in his friendships, and excited about the future he was building with his chosen partner. "Have you given any thought to how we'll maintain our relationship over the summer?" Daphne asked. Her tone, carefully neutral in the way Harry had learned, meant she was worried about something, but trying not to show it. "Actually, yes," Harry replied, setting aside his potions notes. "I've been corresponding with my account manager at Gringotts about purchasing a property where I can live independently. The Dursleys barely tolerate my presence during the school year, and I don't think spending an entire summer there would be good for anyone involved." Daphne's eyes lit up with interest and relief. "You're considering emancipation from your Muggle relatives?" "I'm considering taking control of my own living situation," Harry corrected gently. "I'll still visit them occasionally. They are family, even if we don't get along well. But I think I've outgrown the need to spend my entire summer in Little Whinging, pretending to be a normal Muggle boy." "That's probably wise," Daphne agreed. "Though I have to admit, I was worried about how we'd continue getting to know each other if you were locked away in the Muggle world all summer." Harry reached across the table to take her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past months. "I was worried about the same thing. But if I have my own place, perhaps you could visit sometimes. With your parents' permission, of course." "I think they would approve," Daphne said thoughtfully. "They've been quite pleased with how our relationship has developed. Mother mentioned in her last letter that she's impressed with how mature and thoughtful you've become about pure blood customs and responsibilities." "And what do you think?" Harry asked. Are you impressed with how I've adapted? Daphne squeezed his hand gently. I'm impressed with how you've managed to honor the expectations placed on you while still remaining true to yourself. That's not an easy balance to achieve, especially for someone who was thrown into this world with no preparation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Hermione Granger, who approached their table with an armload of books and a slightly harried expression. Over the past months, Hermione had become a valuable friend to both of them, bridging the gap between Harry's Slytherin identity and his connections to other houses. Sorry to interrupt, Hermione said, settling into an empty chair. But I wanted to ask if you'd heard the rumors about what Professor Quirrell has been up to lately. Harry and Daphne exchanged glances. They had both noticed that their defense against the dark arts professor had been acting more strangely than usual, which was saying something for a man who already seemed nervous around his own shadow. What kind of rumors? Daphne asked carefully. Students have seen him going to the third-floor corridor after hours, Hermione explained in a low voice. The one that's supposed to be off-limits. And he's been asking odd questions about magical protections and ancient spells. Harry felt a chill of unease. Why would he be interested in the forbidden corridor? I don't know, Hermione admitted, but given his position as defense professor, it seems like something we should be concerned about. Before Harry could respond, the conversation was interrupted again by the arrival of Neville Longbottom, who looked even more anxious than usual as he hurried over to their table. Harry, Neville said breathlessly, I need to tell you something. About that night my parents were attacked, about the people who did it. Daphne immediately gestured for Neville to sit down, her expression shifting to one of compassionate concern. What about them, Neville? My grandmother finally told me the full story, Neville continued, his voice shaking slightly. The Death Eaters who tortured my parents, they weren't just looking for information about you-know-who. They were looking for something specific, something they thought my parents had hidden. Harry leaned forward, his full attention focused on Neville's revelation. What kind of something? A prophecy, Neville whispered. The same prophecy that led you-know-who to your family. Grandmother says the Death Eaters believed that if they could find the complete text of the prophecy, they might be able to bring you-know-who back to power. The weight of this information settled over the group like a physical presence. Harry had known about the prophecy's role in targeting his family, but he hadn't realized that it continued to be a source of danger even after Voldemort's defeat. Do you think, Hermione asked slowly, that Professor Quirrell might be looking for the same thing? If it's hidden somewhere in the castle. It would explain his strange behavior, Daphne observed, and his interest in the forbidden areas. Harry felt a familiar surge of the protective instinct that had led him to choose Slytherin House, the need to take action to protect the people and the world he cared about. We need to do something about this. What can we do? Neville asked. We're just first-year students. We can gather information, Harry replied thoughtfully. We can watch Professor Quirrell more carefully, document his activities, and report our concerns to someone who can take action. Professor Snape might listen to us, Daphne suggested. He's our head of house, and he would take threats to the school seriously. Or Professor McGonagall, Hermione added. She's always been fair, and as deputy headmistress, she would have the authority to investigate. As they discussed their options, Harry realized that this situation represented a perfect example of how his relationship with Daphne had evolved beyond their initial contractual arrangement. They were facing a potential crisis together, pooling their knowledge and resources, making decisions based on shared values rather than individual interests. Whatever we decide to do, Daphne said quietly, we should do it together. This affects all of us, and we're stronger working as a team than we would be acting separately. Harry nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for the partnership they had built. Agreed. Though I think we should also involve our other friends. Ron, the other Slytherins, anyone else who might have useful information or skills. That's very Slytherin of you, Hermione observed with a slight smile. Building alliances and using all available resources to achieve your goals. I've learned from the best, Harry replied, looking meaningfully at Daphne. Over the following days, their small group worked carefully to gather information about Professor Quirrell's activities while maintaining the appearance of normal end-of-year preparations. They discovered that several other students had noticed the professor's odd behavior, and that even some of the ghosts had mentioned seeing him in areas where he shouldn't have been. The investigation brought Harry and Daphne even closer together as they spent long hours planning their approach, coordinating with their friends, and supporting each other through the stress of dealing with potentially dangerous magical threats. Harry found himself relying on Daphne's strategic thinking and political instincts, while she appreciated his willingness to take direct action when necessary. I keep thinking about what this means for next year, Daphne said one evening, as they walked around the lake after another day of careful observation and note-taking. If there really are people trying to bring you-know-who back to power, our second year at Hogwarts might be even more eventful than our first. Are you worried? Harry asked. A little, she admitted, but also excited in a strange way. We've proven that we work well together when faced with challenges. If there are more difficulties ahead, at least I know I'll be facing them with someone I trust completely. Harry stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Daphne, I want you to know that this year has been incredible. Not just because we've fulfilled our family's expectations, or because we've learned to make our arrangement work, but because I've genuinely enjoyed every day I've spent getting to know you. Even the difficult days? She asked with a slight smile. Especially the difficult days, Harry replied. Those are the times when I've seen who you really are, how you handle stress, how you support your friends, how you think through complex problems. Those are the qualities that make me excited about spending the next 6 years at Hogwarts with you, and hopefully many years beyond that. Daphne's smile widened, and Harry saw genuine happiness in her expression. I feel the same way about you. When I think about our future now, I don't see obligation or duty. I see partnership and adventure, and the possibility of building something really meaningful together. As they resumed their walk around the lake, Harry reflected on how much his life had changed since that first day on the Hogwarts Express. The marriage contract that had initially seemed like a burden had become the foundation for a relationship that felt both exciting and secure, challenging and supportive. The mysteries surrounding Professor Quirrell and the ongoing threats to the wizarding world would need to be addressed, but Harry felt confident about facing those challenges with Daphne beside him. Whatever the next 6 years brought, he knew they would handle it together. Not because they had to, but because they had chosen to build a life that was stronger and more fulfilling than anything either of them could have achieved alone. Walking through the grounds of Hogwarts with his chosen partner, surrounded by friends who had become like family, Harry felt genuinely optimistic about the future for the first time since learning about the magical world. The boy who had been forced into an arranged marriage had become a young man who was excited about the life he was building through his own choices and commitments. The last day of term arrived with the bittersweet mixture of accomplishment and anticipation that marked the end of every school year. The Great Hall buzzed with excitement as students finished their final exams and prepared for the journey home, their conversations filled with plans for summer holidays and promises to stay in touch with friends they wouldn't see for months. Harry sat at the Slytherin table beside Daphne, watching the familiar chaos of end-of-term preparations while feeling a deep sense of contentment about how much his life had changed over the past 9 months. The nervous boy who had first entered this hall in September, overwhelmed by magic and destiny and arrangements he didn't understand, had been replaced by a young man who felt confident about his place in both the wizarding world and the relationship that would define his future. "I can't quite believe we made it through our first year," Daphne said softly, echoing his thoughts. "Everything feels different now than it did when we started." "Better different, I hope," Harry replied, turning to study her face. After months of friendship and partnership, he had learned to read the subtle expressions that revealed her true feelings beneath her composed exterior. "Much better," she confirmed with a smile that reached her eyes. "I was so worried in September about whether we could make this arrangement work, whether we could find genuine compatibility within the framework our families had created. Now I know we've built something much stronger than either of our parents could have imagined." Professor Dumbledore rose from his seat at the high table, and the great hall gradually quieted as students turned their attention to the traditional end-of-term announcements. But before the headmaster could speak, Professor McGonagall approached the Slytherin table with purposeful steps that suggested official business. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly, "the headmaster would like to speak with you privately after the feast. Miss Greengrass, you're welcome to accompany him if you wish." Harry and Daphne exchanged glances, both wondering what this unexpected summons might involve. Over the past weeks, their investigation into Professor Quirrell's strange behavior had revealed enough concerning evidence that they had ultimately decided to report their findings to Professor Snape, who had assured them that the matter would be handled appropriately. "Thank you, Professor," Harry replied. "We'll come to his office after dinner." As McGonagall returned to the high table, Dumbledore began his traditional end-of-year speech, awarding the House Cup to Slytherin, a victory that brought cheers from Harry's tablemates and knowing smiles from the other houses, who had watched the Serpents accumulate points steadily throughout the year through academic achievement and strategic collaboration. "Congratulations," Hermione said later, as the Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw students offered good-natured acknowledgement of Slytherin's victory. "You've all earned it through excellent work this year." "Thank you," Daphne replied graciously. "Though I have to say, the competition from all houses has been exceptional. It's made us all work harder." Harry watched this exchange with continued appreciation for how naturally Daphne handled inter-house diplomacy, maintaining friendly relationships across traditional rivalries while representing Slytherin interests with dignity and grace. Her political instincts had become invaluable not just for their personal relationship, but for helping him understand how to navigate the complex social dynamics that would shape his adult life in the wizarding world. As the feast concluded and students began dispersing to their dormitories for final packing, Harry and Daphne made their way to Dumbledore's office. The spiral staircase and phoenix-adorned office felt suitably magical and mysterious for whatever conversation awaited them. "Ah, Harry, Miss Greengrass," Dumbledore said warmly as they entered. "Please, sit down. I wanted to speak with you both, before term ended, about several matters that have come to my attention." Harry settled into one of the comfortable chairs facing the headmaster's desk, with Daphne beside him. He noticed that she maintained her characteristic poise, even in this unusual situation, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while her attention remained focused entirely on Dumbledore. "First," Dumbledore continued, "I want to commend you both for the mature and responsible way you've handled the unusual circumstances of your betrothal. Many adults would have struggled to navigate such complexities with the grace and wisdom you've demonstrated." "Thank you, sir," Daphne replied. "We've tried to honor both our families' intentions and our own developing feelings about our future together." "Indeed," Dumbledore nodded approvingly. Which brings me to my second point. I've received correspondence from both the Potter and Greengrass families expressing their satisfaction with how your relationship has progressed. They're particularly pleased that you've chosen to embrace the arrangement rather than merely endure it. Harry felt a warmth of pride at this acknowledgement. We've been fortunate to discover genuine compatibility and friendship within the framework our parents created. More than friendship, I believe, Dumbledore observed with twinkling eyes. You've developed a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and complementary strengths. Such relationships are rare at any age, and particularly remarkable among people so young. The headmaster paused to offer them tea from a service that appeared with a gentle wave of his hand, then continued with a more serious expression. However, I also wanted to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding certain activities that have been taking place within the castle this year. Professor Snape has informed me of your observations regarding Professor Quirrell's behavior. Harry leaned forward slightly. We were concerned about his activities in forbidden areas of the castle, particularly given the rumors about what might be hidden there. Your concerns were well-founded, Dumbledore said gravely. Professor Quirrell has indeed been attempting to access certain magical protections within the castle, though I can assure you that his efforts have been unsuccessful. The situation has been resolved and will not pose a threat to students returning next year. Was he really trying to find the prophecy? Daphne asked quietly. Among other things, yes, Dumbledore confirmed. But the prophecy in question is no longer accessible to those who would misuse it, and Professor Quirrell will not be returning to Hogwarts. We will have a new defense against the dark arts teacher next year. Harry felt relief wash over him at this news. The shadow that had hung over the latter part of the school year could finally be put to rest. More importantly, Dumbledore continued, your careful investigation and responsible reporting of your concerns demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and collaboration that will serve you well in the years to come. You worked together effectively, involved trustworthy friends when appropriate, and sought adult guidance when the situation required intervention beyond your capabilities. We tried to balance taking appropriate action with recognizing our limitations as first-year students, Harry said. A balance that many adults struggle to achieve, Dumbledore noted approvingly. Which leads me to my final point. The coming years will bring new challenges and opportunities for both of you, individually and as partners. The foundation you've built this year, of trust, communication, and shared purpose, will serve you well in facing whatever lies ahead. As they prepared to leave Dumbledore's office, the headmaster offered one final observation. Harry, you chose Slytherin House, not because the Sorting Hat placed you there, but because you recognized that your goals could best be achieved through the strategic thinking and political awareness that Slytherin values. That same quality of thoughtful decision-making will serve you well as you continue to shape your relationship with Miss Greengrass and your role in the larger wizarding community. Walking back through the castle corridors toward their dormitories, Harry and Daphne reflected on how their first year had exceeded every expectation they had held in September. When I think about going home tomorrow, Daphne said, as they paused at the entrance to the Slytherin common room, I'm not sad about leaving school behind for the summer. I'm excited about telling my parents how well everything has worked out, and about planning for next year. I feel the same way, Harry agreed, though I have to admit, I'm going to miss our daily conversations and shared experiences. The summer feels like a long time to be apart. It doesn't have to be, Daphne pointed out with a smile. You mentioned purchasing your own property, and my parents have already extended an invitation for you to visit us at Greengrass Manor whenever you'd like. We have the entire summer to continue getting to know each other, without the pressures of schoolwork and house politics. Harry felt his heart lift at the thought. I'd like that very much. And Daphne, thank you. For what? For everything. For being patient with me when I was struggling to understand pure blood customs. For sharing your knowledge and helping me find my place in Slytherin House. For becoming someone I genuinely care about, rather than just someone I was obligated to marry. He paused, then continued more quietly. For making me excited about our future together, instead of resigned to it. Daphne's smile was radiant in the torchlight of the corridor. Thank you for the same things, for choosing to embrace our arrangement rather than merely enduring it, for becoming my friend and partner before becoming my intended husband, for making me feel like our future is something we're building together rather than something that's being imposed on us. As they said their final goodnights and prepared to return to their respective dormitories for the last time as first-year students, Harry felt a profound sense of accomplishment about everything he had achieved during his first year at Hogwarts. He had mastered the basics of magic, earned excellent marks in all his subjects, and gained the respect of his professors. He had successfully integrated himself into Slytherin House while maintaining friendships across house lines. He had learned to navigate the complex world of pure-blood politics and wizarding society. Most importantly, he had transformed a marriage contract that had initially felt like a burden into the foundation for a relationship that brought him genuine happiness and excitement about the future. The girl who had approached him on the Hogwarts Express with news of their betrothal had become someone he couldn't imagine his life without. Not because he had to marry her, but because he wanted to build a life with her. Lying in his four-poster bed in the Slytherin dormitory for the last time as a first-year student, Harry thought about the 7 years that lay ahead of them at Hogwarts, and the many years beyond that as adults in the wizarding world. The challenges they would face, the decisions they would make together, the family they might eventually create. For the first time since learning about the magical world, Harry felt genuinely optimistic about every aspect of his future. He had found his place in the wizarding community, discovered abilities and interests he never could have imagined, and formed relationships that would sustain him through whatever difficulties lay ahead. The marriage contract that had once seemed like the end of his freedom had become the beginning of a partnership that enhanced rather than constrained his possibilities. Tomorrow, he would leave Hogwarts as a young man who had not only accepted his destiny, but had actively chosen to embrace it, transforming obligation into opportunity and arrangement into authentic affection. The train journey home would take him away from the castle that had become his sanctuary and the daily companionship of the girl who had become his chosen partner. But it would also take him toward a summer of continued discovery about himself, his relationship, and the life he was building within the extraordinary world of magic